What purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, by direction of the Committee on Rules, I call up House Resolution 645 and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the resolution.
House Calendar number 107, House Resolution 645, resolved that upon adoption of this resolution, it shall be in order to consider in the House the bill H.R. 38 to amend Title 18 United States Code to provide a means by which non-residents of a state whose residents may carry concealed firearms may also do so in the state. All points of order against consideration of the bill are waived. In lieu of the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on the Judiciary now printed in the bill, an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 115-45 shall be considered as adopted. The bill as amended shall be considered as read. All points of order against provisions in the bill as amended are waived. The previous question shall be considered as ordered on the bill as amended, and on any further amendment thereto to final passage without intervening motion except 1 hour of debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Judiciary, and 2, 1 motion to recommit with or without instructions.
The gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 1 hour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For the purpose of debate only, I yield the customary 30 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Hastings, pending which I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman may proceed.
During the consideration of this resolution, all time is yielded for the purposes of debate only. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and to include extraneous materials on House Resolution 645 currently under consideration.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased to bring forward this rule on behalf of the Rules Committee. The rule provides for consideration of H.R. 38, the Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act. The rule provides for 1 hour of debate equally divided between the chairman and ranking member of the Judiciary Committee. The rule also provides for a motion to recommit. Yesterday, the Rules Committee had the opportunity to hear from my fellow Judiciary Committee members, Chairman Goodlatte, Ranking Member Nadler, as well as Congressman Sheila Jackson Lee and others. The ranking member of the Sheila Jackson Lee, who happens to be the ranking member of the Crime Subcommittee. Last month, the Judiciary Committee rigorously debated H.R. 38 and considered 22 amendments to this legislation. The committee also marked up and discussed H.R. 4477, the Fix-Nix Act, which is incorporated into the Rules Committee print. I would like to thank my friend from North Carolina, Mr. Hudson, for introducing this legislation, which takes a common sense approach and reflects our constitutional right to bear arms. Mr. Speaker, all of us in this body took an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution. And as well as we all understand, the Constitution enshrines our right to keep and bear arms in the Second Amendment. Over the years, the right has been challenged in court and in some cases by public opinion. However, lest there be any question about the constitutionality of our right to keep and bear arms, let me remind my colleagues that the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, recognized in a 2008 opinion that the Second Amendment conferred an individual right to keep and bear arms. As a son of a Georgia State trooper, I learned the respect for firearms at a very early age. I have shared that respect with my boys and daughter. As a member of Congress, I believe I have a duty to uphold American liberties for current and future generations. I'm a co-sponsor of the Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act because I believe constitutional rights extend past state lines. Mr. Speaker, the Bill of Rights isn't a philosophical exercise. It's a document that protects the practical expression of liberties that our forefathers recognized as essential elements of our democracy. I myself have a concealed carry permit, and as a husband and father, I have prioritized being able to defend my family and my home should the unthinkable happen. I'm also a sportsman, a hunter, and an ardent defender of the Second Amendment. But like many others, the primary purpose of my owning and keeping a concealed carry permit is self-defense, and I don't think that right should be undermined simply because I travel to another state. This bill upholds and recognizes state laws while ensuring that driving across state lines to run an errand, go to work, or visit a relative doesn't block out an individual's rights. Mr. Speaker, I tell you a very recent story about how firearms play a critical role in self-defense and promote public safety. Just yesterday in Dawson County, in a part of my district in northeast Georgia, a woman witnessed an individual attacking a sheriff's deputy at a local gas station. The woman was in possession of a firearm and fired at the suspect. While details are still unfolding, at this point it highlights the benefits of a citizenry that is reasonably and responsibly armed. Contrary to the claims of Second Amendment detractors, and Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act is not about expanding access to firearms or putting guns in the hands of criminals. On the contrary, the bill includes protections to uphold laws surrounding firearm possession and safeguard individuals' ability to protect themselves and their neighbors. The Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act supports the Second Amendment rights of law-abiding Americans, and importantly, it offers a solution to the current patchwork of state laws affecting concealed carry permits. Currently, all 50 states issue concealed carry permits in some capacity, but these laws leave citizens traveling across state lines to decipher a variety of state laws or risk inadvertently breaking the law. It is also worth noting that of the states that have adopted right to carry legislation, no state has repealed it. Moreover, Mr. Speaker, we simply have no evidence to indicate that concealed carry permit holders pose a risk to public safety. The Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act upholds states' rights to establish their own permitting requirements, but it takes the common sense step of allowing individuals who meet the criteria for concealed carry in their home states to bear arms in other states as long as they follow the local concealed carry laws of the state that they are in at any given time. The bill does not allow individuals who currently would be prohibited under federal law from possessing firearms to obtain those weapons, and it doesn't tell states how to regulate the use of firearms. It does, however, ensure that law-abiding citizens can protect themselves and exercise their Second Amendment rights when crossing state lines. 30 states, including Georgia, already have shall issue permits, which require states to issue permits to individuals who meet the legal requirements for a concealed carry permit. 8 states have a may issue law that allows discretionary permit laws, and 12 states allow for carrying of a concealed weapon without any permit or license at all. While many states have some type of reciprocity whereby they mutually recognize permits from other states or may honor permits or licenses issued by other jurisdictions, moreover, there are some states that neither recognize out-of-state concealed carry permits nor issue permits to non-residents, resulting in a complete ban on the concealed carry rights of non-residents who find themselves in those states. The legal landscape of these state laws and their terms for recognizing concealed carry permits is complex. Yet, Mr. Speaker, we must recognize and remember that at a practical level, our union focuses by acknowledging the necessary reciprocity on certain state functions, this being one of them and should be. But the current patchwork of state law means that these law-abiding individuals have to stop and think about their state, about their rights, whether they are located at the time, and recognize their Second Amendment rights, or they risk breaking the law. Also, Mr. Speaker, H.R. 38 includes the text of the Fixed NICS Act. The Fixed NICS Act ensures individuals who are prohibited from receiving firearms are properly documented in the NICS system, and it would require federal agencies to report relevant records in accordance with the law. Mr. Speaker, the legislation before us upholds a constitutional right to keep and bear arms and recognizes the fact that the Bill of Rights isn't limited to certain jurisdictions. Our founding fathers carved certain foundational rights into our democracy, and today's bill simply upholds the spirit and the letter of the Second Amendment. With that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves his time. The gentleman from Florida.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my friend from Georgia for yielding to me the customary 30 minutes for debate, and I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, this is the 54th closed rules brought by the Republican majority to the floor. Yesterday in the Rules Committee, I pointed that out, as well as the fact that there were 25 members of this body who offered amendments that were not made in order. Significant numbers of them were germane, and they were bipartisan. We can't continue to ignore the importance of allowing for full membership to participate on behalf of their constituents. Today's bill combines two bills. One, a bipartisan supported approach to strengthening background checks. The other, a disgraceful handout to the powerful gun lobby and gun manufacturers. I also pointed out last night that the NRA, in many respects, is two bodies, those at the top and the rank and file members. Many of the rank and file members, for example, support universal background checks that we could be talking about in this measure if an amendment seeking to have it made in order had been made in order. A month ago yesterday, this country grieved with our brothers and sisters in Sutherland Springs, Texas, as they reel from one of the worst mass shootings this country has ever suffered. A man walked into a house of worship as churchgoers prayed and sprayed bullets throughout the building. He killed an 18-month-old baby. He killed 8 members of one family. He killed the pastor's 14-year-old daughter and a total of 26 people, and he was able to do so in a matter of minutes. We learned later that this man had served in the Air Force and while there had been court-martialed for committing acts of domestic violence against his wife and infant child. As part of his sentence, he was prohibited from purchasing or possessing firearms. Tragically, this information was never put into the National Instant Background Check System, and we call that NICS. And he was able to pass a background check and come into possession of several guns he would use to murder 26 innocent people in Sutherland Springs, Texas on November 5th, 2017. This tragic event is instructive to the bill brought by us today. Clearly, our background check system must be strengthened. The problems with our background check system are more grave than we previously could even imagine, as recent reports indicate that the FBI has sought to retrieve guns from thousands of people that the background check system should have blocked from buying a weapon, but who ultimately were allowed to do so. I think we can all agree that if we have a system through which people like the murderer in Sutherland Springs can buy a gun, or one in which thousands of people who should have never been allowed to buy a gun in the first place are able to do so, then we really have no system at all. Today's bill, in part, would have been a good first step in addressing those weaknesses. But, Mr. Speaker, my Republican colleagues, in a fashion so common for their majority this Congress, have decided to sabotage a common-sense bipartisan bill by combining it with a reckless piece of legislation that will allow guns to be carried all over this country. Let us remember that the gunman in Texas was a known domestic abuser. He abused his wife and he abused his child. Under today's concealed carry, all we would have to do is change wife to girlfriend. And in some states, he will be able to obtain a concealed carry permit for a handgun. Should today's bill become law, he would then be allowed to bring that concealed handgun into your state, even if your state does not allow convicted domestic abusers to have concealed weapons. For example, Mr. Speaker, the state that I'm privileged and proud to represent, Florida, stops abusive dating partners from carrying loaded hidden handguns in public. However, my friend from Georgia state, right over the border, does not have that same restriction. Under this legislation, Florida would be mandated to allow abusive dating partners with concealed permits from Georgia to carry their weapons in Florida. Under H.R. 38, violent offenders and people with no firearm safety training would be able to carry hidden loaded guns even if they could not otherwise legally purchase a gun in the state. Footnote right there. Like my friend from Georgia, I too have a concealed carry permit in the state of Florida, and I am a firm believer in the Second Amendment and a person's right to own a weapon. But I also think we should be discussing today matters such as the bump stock, and there were amendments that dealt with that were not made in order. I think we should be discussing assault weapons in the hands of the public. And I, for the life of me, do not understand how anybody other than people in law enforcement and the military need an AK-47 or multiple firing gun. Mr. Speaker, this idea that we are presented with here is so terrible, so anathema to common sense and decency, that one has to wonder aloud, where did such an idea come from? Well, we have an answer, and it's probably not too surprising. Today's concealed carry bill is brought to you by the Republican Party via their very influential friends in the powerful gun lobby. Footnote right there. The gun lobby does the bidding of gun manufacturers who benefit immensely. Why don't we just pass a mandate that every woman, man, and child in America must buy a gun? And maybe that would satisfy or satiate gun manufacturers with reference to how they continuously cause us to do things that are not common sense matters as it pertains to guns. In fact, this bill, which will allow domestic abusers to carry concealed weapons across state lines, is the top priority for the gun lobby. Well, happy holidays, fellas. But we here on this side of the aisle are going to do everything that we can to make sure you don't get it. And when this matter gets to the other body, I can assure my friend from Georgia and all of the speakers on either side today that it is going nowhere. So what are we doing by bringing this measure in the first place? Is it a distraction? Is it an absolute necessity that we do this? Mr. Speaker, just so we are crystal clear, what is happening right now in the People's House, let me reiterate, just over 2 months after a gunman killed 58 people and wounded nearly 550 people in Las Vegas, and just over a month after another gunman killed 26 people in their church as they prayed, this Republican majority, in response to those atrocities, saw fit to bring to the floor a bill that would allow violent offenders to carry concealed weapons all across the country. Let that sink in. This isn't the only time that we've done something along these lines. After Sandy Hook, after children were killed and their teachers were killed, we did nothing. At Virginia Tech, where people were killed in significant numbers, at a military base there, in Colorado in a theater, in Orlando, Florida in a nightclub, repeatedly we have seen these multiple shootings or mass shootings as they are referred to, where 3 or 4 more people or more people are killed. 330 times this year alone we've had mass shootings, and yet we come here with a bill talking about carrying concealed weapons. Every day in America, 93 people on average are killed with a gun, 7 of them children. But in the midst of this gun violence epidemic, and that's what it is, what did my Republican colleagues do? Did they bring to the floor legislation to close the gun show loophole? Or did they close loopholes to prevent domestic abusers from purchasing guns? Or are they considering a ban on so-called bump stocks that turn semi-automatic weapons into illegal automatic guns, most recently used to rain carnage down on innocent concert goers in Las Vegas? One country music singer pointed out that his band had legal guns, but they were afraid to bring them out in Las Vegas because the authorities couldn't ferret out who was doing the shooting. We had that in a Walmart that all of us saw post the gun shooting, where people with guns caused confusion among the police. Footnote there, this bill proposes to study the issue of bump stocks. Study bump stocks. Mr. Speaker, we don't need a study. As my colleague, Congresswoman Dina Titus, who represents the city of Las Vegas, said last night at the Rules Committee, the only study we need is to go look at the 58 crosses in her district. That's what bump stocks do. That's your study. Did my Republican colleagues bring to the floor a bill that would have addressed any of these common sense proposals? Of course not, because even though those proposals have the support of an overwhelming majority of American people when it comes to guns, that is not what motivates my Republican friends. What they care about is the gun lobby and gun manufacturers and their wish list. That is why we are here today. Mr. Speaker, my friends on the other side of the aisle like to compare a concealed carry permit to a driver's license. But let me set the record straight, because that comparison is nothing but a gross exercise in false equivalency. A driver's license must meet stringent, uniform federal criteria established under the REAL ID Act. This includes a photo of the license holder and data, including their date of birth and their state of residency. There are absolutely no such uniform standards when it comes to concealed carry permits. In some states, they could look like a paper library card. In others, they may have photo identification. And there is no national database, no hotline that contains permit information from all 50 states. So law enforcement would be in a position of having to find each individual issuing agency to verify that a concealed carry permit is valid, and that is impossible. My Republican colleagues often tout their support for our first responders. Well, I urge them to heed the warnings of those brave men and women. Major law enforcement groups understand how dangerous this bill would be, and that is why so many of them oppose what the majority is trying to do here today. Organizations like the Major Cities Chiefs Association, Police Foundation, and Police Executive Research Forum all stand in strong opposition to today's bill. To make matters worse, this piece of legislation even exposes members of the law enforcement community to personal litigation if they mistakenly question someone's ability to carry a concealed weapon. Mr. Speaker, this is not just some small issue limiting a law enforcement officer's ability to carry out their job. This limit on challenging concealed carry permits will cost lives. In fact, a recent study conducted by Stanford University found that when states weaken law enforcement's authority to deny permits to those who pose a danger to the community, violent crime goes up by 13 to 15%. This research is clear, convincing, and not at all difficult to fathom. When you lift limits on who can carry a concealed weapon, gun-related crime goes up. It's that simple. Mr. Speaker, among the many important issues this body must address, the following stand out. As of this moment, we are roughly 72 hours away from a government shutdown. We have 800,000 persons that we refer to as dreamers who continue to wait for us to do the right thing and bring them fully into the only country that they know as home. And we have 9 million children and their parents facing an unconscionable lapse in life-saving funding for the incredibly important Children's Health Insurance Program. Given all that, what does the Republican-controlled Congress do? They bring a bill to the floor that will make it easier for domestic abusers to cross state lines with concealed weapons. This is shameful and no way to run a government. Last night, I thought actively too long, trying to go to sleep, about what the acronym GOP, Grand Old Party, the conservatives, the states' rights conservatives, the fiscal conservatives who are about to dump a serious debt on our children, should be called now by their acronym. Rather than GOP, in light of the choice that they make with reference to guns, perhaps GOP should stand for guns over people. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, it is my privilege to yield 3 minutes to the gentlelady from Missouri, Ms. Hartzler, who has some language in this bill and is also would like to thank her support of this legislation as well. And I yield now 3 minutes to Ms. Hartzler.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I rise in support of H.R. 38, the Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act. This bill, which reaffirms the Second Amendment rights of all law-abiding citizens to keep and bear arms in every state, includes a provision I introduced earlier this year as the Police Officers Protecting Children Act. My provision would help protect our children from school shootings and empower local law enforcement to respond rapidly in the case of an emergency. As many of you who represent rural areas know, in these sparsely populated regions, our local law enforcement is stretched thin. My bill would amend the Gun-Free School Zones Act to allow school boards to permit off-duty and retired police officers to carry their firearms on school campuses so they can respond quickly in the event of a crisis. The legislation would expand the reach of local police officers, decrease emergency response time, and put more choice back in the hands of our local school districts. It's a win-win-win. As we've learned over and over, localities are much better equipped to know what works for their district rather than the federal government. In fact, the idea of my bill came from a constituent who is a retired police officer and served his community for 30 years. This gentleman came to me because he wasn't allowed to use his weapon to protect his grandchildren at school, even though he had decades of experience and continued to pass an annual recertification test. Additionally, the sheriff of Laclede County in my district said, not allowing current law enforcement officers or qualified retired law enforcement officers to carry weapons at schools simply puts children's lives at risk. I agree. I thank the Judiciary Committee for including my legislation in this important bill, and I urge my colleagues to support the rule and the underlying bill. I yield back.
Gentleman from Georgia reserves his time. Gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to yield to a very good friend of mine, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Ingle.
How much time does the gentleman yield? How much time does the gentleman from Florida yield to the gentleman?
1 minute.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in opposition to H.R. 38, the Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act. This dangerous bill is an attack on common-sense gun laws across the country. It will force states like mine in New York, with carefully crafted gun laws, to recognize the concealed carry permits from all other states. This bill doesn't create a national standard. Instead, it lets the states with the weakest laws dictate the safety of everyone else. 31 states require safety training. 35 states prohibit domestic abusers from carrying concealed weapons. 27 states prohibit people convicted of violent misdemeanors from carrying concealed weapons. All of these states' laws will be overridden if H.R. 38 passes. It's unconscionable that in the wake of two of the worst mass shootings in modern American history, Republicans are still trying to dismantle gun laws. It's like Alice in Wonderland. We must fight on behalf of the safety for all Americans and pass comprehensive gun safety laws, not this dangerous bill. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Florida reserves his time. Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my time and privilege to yield 3 minutes to a fellow member of the Judiciary Committee, the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. King.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman from Georgia for yielding, and I rise in strong support of the underlying bill, H.R. 38. Or maybe that's the lead bill, and there's an underlying bill that's been attached to it. And I want to speak a little bit here, Mr. Speaker, about this process. First of all, though, we have a concealed carry bill before us that is a good and an excellent bill that's been hard-worked and well-vetted. And I want to thank Mr. Hudson, Richard Hudson, for his diligent work on this for a number of years. A year and a half or more ago, we had this bill about ready to go before the Judiciary Committee. I raised an issue. My concern was that it didn't allow for the proper respect for the states, 7 then, 12 now, who have a legitimate constitutional carry, which is, since you have a Second Amendment right, you have a right to carry a weapon. And under this bill now, having incorporated the amendment that I had prepared a year and a half or so ago, that allows then for the residents of the states who have constitutional carry to then travel into other states. If they're legal in their home state, they're legal in another state under this bill without having to require the states that respect full constitutional carry to produce permits for their citizens and their residents to travel into neighboring states or anywhere in the country. I think that's a significant improvement, and I thank Mr. Hudson for his cooperation and work on that. It's like I say, this is a good and solid bill. I am, however, concerned about this process, and when I hear the gentleman, Mr. Hastings, speak about this is the 54th closed rule that we have seen. I'm for a lot of open rules. I'm for open debate. I want to fight it out in committee, and I want to fight it out here on the floor. And our founding fathers understood that. They set this system up this way. They said to all of us, go to your district, pull the best ideas you have there, generate your own good ideas, bring them here and let them compete in this marketplace of ideas. But if we don't have the window to compete with ideas, if we don't have that opportunity to have the debates, if we don't have the opportunity to force votes on amendments, then the best that America has to offer eventually doesn't show up in law or to the president's desk. This is one of those circumstances where we learned that a bill that didn't have a number the morning that we marked this up in committee is now the Fix NICS bill. It got a number sometime that same day. There was not a full opportunity to vet the Fix NICS bill. I'm very apprehensive about what it might do to this country. I'd like to have had hearings and learned what kind of American citizens, law-abiding citizens, will be disadvantaged by the Fix NICS bill, whose names get on that and why. How do you get those names off when you need to be cleaning up the list? I want to have everybody on the list that belongs on the list, but I don't want anybody on the list that doesn't belong on the list. I want to protect American people, and I want to protect constitutional rights. But we didn't get an opportunity to look into this, and anybody that did, that brought an amendment to the Rules Committee, it came to the floor under a closed rule. And so I'm concerned, I'm apprehensive about this. In fact, as I look through these provisions, Section 103, Vicky Hartzler's section in the bill, I strongly support. And Section 104, could I ask for another 30 seconds?
Can you give 15? 15.
Gentleman's recognized for 15 seconds.
Thank you. I support also the section there are the judges, but I offered an amendment in committee that too many members weren't there, at least 10 Republicans were gone, to protect congressional members of Congress in the same way as the judges. We didn't have that opportunity to actually have a hearing on it in the committee, a legitimate one, and we didn't have an opportunity to bring that amendment to the floor. So I have this apprehension. I urge that we get back to regular order, and I thank the gentleman for yielding to me. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Georgia reserves his
Mr.
time.
Speaker, my
Gentleman
friend from Iowa, Mr. King, had 2 amendments that were rejected last night in the Rules Committee. I join him in saying that we need to get back to regular order. Mr. Speaker, would you be so kind as to inform me and my friend from Georgia how much time we have remaining?
Gentleman from Florida has 11 3/4 minutes. From Georgia has 18 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased at this time to yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Washington, Ms. Jayapal, a distinguished member of the Judiciary Committee.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for yielding. I rise in strong opposition to H.R. 38, the Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act. Our country is still reeling, Mr. Speaker, from 2 of the worst mass shootings in modern American history, from the 58 people murdered in Las Vegas to the 25 killed in a Texas church. How can we face the families of these people and say that this bill is the best we could do? Studies show that states with laws permitting concealed carry experience an estimated 13 to 15% increase in violent crime than there would have been without the right to carry laws. But we don't need academic studies, Mr. Speaker, to know that this bill is wrong. We just need to look at real people. One of my constituent sisters was shot in Las Vegas and survived. She's one of the lucky ones. They won't have any empty spots at the holiday table this year because they lost someone to gun violence. Over 14,000 Americans, including parents of nearly 700 children, are not as less fortunate, and my heart goes out to them, especially as we enter the holiday season. Today, we have a critical opportunity to say enough is enough, and I strongly urge my colleagues to stop this heinous bill from moving forward. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Florida reserves his time. Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from Michigan. A fine member who is strong support of this bill is appreciated, and we'll recognize him now for 4 minutes.
Gentleman's recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of H.R. 38, the Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act, and the underlying rule. The Second Amendment right to bear arms must stand resolute, as should all our constitutional rights. This legislation simply affirms the right of law-abiding citizens to effectively exercise their right in other states as they do at home. 42 states broadly recognize the right of law-abiding citizens to carry concealed handguns, and most states allow some form of concealed carry. State recognition of concealed carry licenses from other states is not uniform or consistent. Those who wish to carry a concealed weapon across state lines are subject to a confusing patchwork of state laws that make it difficult for law-abiding citizens to travel with a firearm without fear of prosecution. Mr. Speaker, contrary to what critics who have you believe, this legislation does not upend state laws or expand access to firearms. States will still have the right and the ability to set specific conditions for residents to conceal carry, and individuals from other states must abide by those laws and rules when they carry in other states. This legislation does not lessen limitations on gun purchases. If you are prohibited from purchasing a firearm now, they will continue to be prohibited from purchasing a firearm if this bill is passed. If you can't legally own or carry a firearm today, this legislation will not allow you to do so after it is passed. This legislation is about respecting our Constitution. Our other constitutional rights, like free speech, do not expire when we cross state lines. They're not restricted by state lines. So why should we also allow the Second Amendment to be limited by state lines? Indeed, the core of the Second Amendment is self-defense, and the ability to carry a firearm outside your home is a critical component of that constitutional right. That is why 24 states' attorney generals, including Michigan's Attorney General Bill Schuette, submitted a letter supporting this legislation. They know, like I do, that this legislation is common sense. It prioritizes the rights of law-abiding citizens to conceal carry and the ability to travel freely from state to state without worry about conflicting state laws and prosecution. Mr. Speaker, each of us are required to take an oath of office here. In that oath, we swear to uphold and defend our Constitution, the Constitution of the United States. That's what this legislation exactly does. It makes sure we exercise our constitutional rights throughout the United States. My colleague on the other side of the aisle questions proceeding with this legislation while funding for the federal government hangs in the balance the next 72 hours. I agree. We must keep the lights on. We are all responsible for keeping the lights on. It isn't as if it's one side of the aisle or the other. And in the past, it's been a bipartisan agreement to do so. Suddenly, the other side of the aisle says if we don't get exactly what we want on terms we have, including on DACA, we'll take it to the precipice. A solution on DACA is there if my colleagues wish to take it. At this point, so far, they haven't. But there are some things that aren't malleable. There's right and there's wrong in this. I suggest we solve it in the next 72 hours. And we keep the lights on because we are all equally responsible for that. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Georgia reserves his time. Gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Oregon, my good friend, who is a member of the Ways and Means Committee, Mr. Blumenauer.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. Why should the United States of America be the only rich country in the world that cannot protect our families from gun violence? It doesn't have to be this way. In fact, there are a number of states that have enacted gun safety protections. And in those states that have done so, there are fewer gun deaths and there are fewer gun injuries. My state of Oregon is one of those that has enacted them, in part because of votes of the people, not politicians. This proposal would strip away protections of Oregonians, because there are 12 states that basically, if you're 21 and a pulse, you can carry a firearm. Others have much less restrictive proposals. This eliminates the ability of states to protect its own citizens. It's shameful. It's wrong. Someday, Congress will come to its senses and enact reasonable gun safety legislation for the country. But until we do, for heaven's sakes, don't punish states that have accepted their responsibilities to protect their families.
Gentleman from Florida reserves his time. Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to my colleague from Georgia, Drew Ferguson.
Gentleman's recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of H.R. 38, the Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act. As a lifelong gun owner and staunch advocate for protecting our Second Amendment rights, I'm proud to co-sponsor this legislation. H.R. 38 would protect law-abiding gun owners with concealed carry permits like the single mother, Shaneen Allen of Pennsylvania. Many of you have heard this story. I know the author of this bill, Mr. Hudson, has told this story many times, and where Miss Allen was arrested in New Jersey during a routine traffic stop because her valid Pennsylvania concealed carry license had no legal standing in New Jersey. Our constitutionally protected Second Amendment rights should not stop at a state line. This common sense bill would ensure that concealed carry permits holders' rights to carry firearms across all state lines will exist. The legislation would allow Georgia's 600,000 plus concealed carry permit holders to remain protected while traveling. The bill would also incentivize states to report individuals prohibiting from owning guns to the FBI's National Criminal Background Check System, better known as the NICS system, and it gives states the resources they need to follow this law. This would not put an additional burden on law-abiding gun owners or make it more difficult for them to purchase or carry a firearm. It simply ensures that agencies and bureaucrats are following the existing laws. I appreciate Mr. Hudson's hard work to advance this common sense legislation to protect Americans' constitutional rights, and I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this rule and the bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Georgia reserves his time. Gentleman from Florida.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from North Carolina, my good friend, Mr. Price.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the bill before us creates a dangerous race to the bottom, forcing states to accept concealed carry permits from all other states, regardless of their training standards, their background check system, or their safety requirements. Make no mistake, this bill would make it easier to cross state lines with hidden, loaded weapons, threatening local communities by making it harder for law enforcement to determine who's lawfully carrying a firearm. No wonder sheriffs, police chiefs, other law enforcement agencies oppose this bill. What a shame it is that after the terrible mass shootings in Las Vegas and Texas, the first gun-related bill this House considers would actually make it easier for dangerous people to carry concealed weapons in more places. Mr. Speaker, these tragedies aren't inevitable. They are the result of policy choices. We could be working together to enact common sense measures to respond to the gun violence epidemic facing our country. But as long as Republicans are beholden to NRA extremism, these proposals, I'm afraid, will fall on deaf ears. I urge my colleagues to reject this shameful proposal, to work instead to address the root causes of gun violence in this country.
Gentleman from Florida reserves his time. Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This time it's also my privilege to yield 2 minutes for the gentleman from Augusta, Georgia, Rick Allen.
Gentleman's recognized.
All right. Thanks to my colleague. And Mr. Speaker, I rise today to urge my colleagues to support H.R. 38, the Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act. Since I was elected to Congress in 2014, I have been devoted to preserving the constitutional rights of Americans, including the inalienable right to bear arms. Despite our Second Amendment protections, many states have laws restricting the ability of citizens to carry concealed weapons, principally out-of-state residents. This is particularly confusing and burdensome for law-abiding citizens who choose to conceal carry and live near a state line. For example, the district I represent borders South Carolina along the Savannah River. For many of my constituents, the closest grocery store, bank, and even their work may be in South Carolina. Thankfully for my constituents, Georgia and South Carolina already have firearm permit reciprocity. But this is not the case everywhere. As the law currently stands, Americans in other states are losing their right to bear arms on a daily basis simply because they live near a state line. Just as your First Amendment right to free speech does not change from one state to another, neither should your right to protect yourself and your family. I hope my colleagues will see this and will join me in voting for this common sense legislation to solve this problem. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Georgia reserves his time. Gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very privileged to yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from New Jersey, my good friend, Mr. Pascrell.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise as the co-chair of law enforcement in the Congress of the United States. This bill is terrible. The Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act should not be voted on. As a may-issue state, New Jersey allows local law enforcement the discretion on issuing concealed carry permits. In order to receive a permit, applicants must demonstrate an urgent need to carry a concealed weapon, pass a safety course on par with firearms training required of police officers. H.R. 38 would undermine the good reputations of New Jersey has in place by forcing New Jersey and other states to recognize the concealed carry standards from every other state, even if the regulations are weak or non-existent. Allowing states with the weakest concealed carry requirements to set the national standard creates a race to the bottom. Aside from the outrageous fact that House Republicans are pushing a bill to weaken states' rights, this bill makes it harder for local law enforcement to do their jobs. This bill does not establish a process for officers to easily verify that someone is carrying lawfully, because officers would be essentially required to know the permitting standards of every state. A heavy and unnecessary burden, Mr. Speaker. Most alarming, the bill opens up law enforcement.
I don't have any more time.
I yield.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Florida reserves his time. Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, it is my privilege to recognize the gentlelady from Wyoming, Liz Cheney, for as much time as she may consume.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of the rule for consideration of H.R. 38 and the underlying bill, the Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act. The Second Amendment to the United States Constitution, Mr. Speaker, protects the individual right of American citizens to keep and bear arms. This is a fundamental right to our great republic. In Wyoming, Mr. Speaker, we know that this is a God-given right enshrined in our Constitution, which is why Wyoming is a constitutional carry state. Wyoming is not alone in this Constitution-based conviction. Across the country, Mr. Speaker, 42 states broadly recognize the right of law-abiding citizens to carry concealed handguns. Further, all 50 states allow some form of concealed carry. And many states, but not all, Mr. Speaker, already recognize the gun laws of other states. However, Mr. Speaker, those traveling through or living on the border of a state that does not recognize their home state's laws could have their gun rights stripped when they cross state lines. That's wrong, Mr. Speaker. This puts otherwise law-abiding citizens in a situation where they may be criminally liable for simply carrying out their constitutional right to keep and bear arms. The constitutional rights of United States citizens should not change or end at state lines, Mr. Speaker. The Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act ensures the rights of law-abiding citizens to travel across state lines without worrying about the conflicting patchwork of state concealed carry laws or regulations. This bill is crucial to protecting our constitutional rights. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to support this rule and the underlying bill, and I yield back. Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Georgia reserves his time. Gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Massachusetts, my friend, Mr. Moulton.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 26. That's how many people were gunned down in a Texas church. 59. That's how many were murdered at a concert in Las Vegas. 489. That's how many law-abiding Americans were injured in that same attack. Ladies and gentlemen, it has been weeks after those shootings, and we haven't taken a single action in the United States Congress to stop the gun violence epidemic plaguing America. Instead, Republican leadership is pushing a bill with blood money from the NRA that will create a race to the bottom, where states with the weakest concealed carry requirements will rewrite the laws for everyone else. Meanwhile, we all know there are bipartisan bills that will reduce gun deaths, including my bill to ban bump stocks. Those bills have been denied a vote. Mr. Speaker, we have lived through too many massacres, and at this rate, I guarantee we will live through more. Let's stop this nonsense and work together on common sense solutions the majority of Americans want. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from Florida reserves. Gentleman from Georgia reserves. Gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Rhode Island, my good friend, Mr. Langevin.
The gentleman is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong opposition to H.R. 38, which unconscionably combines a need of reform to improve background checks with a wholesale abandonment of sanity with respect to gun permitting. The Fix-Nix Act would improve notifications about criminal activity for background checks, which I strongly support, a system, by the way, that tragically failed prior to the Sutherland Springs shooting. Unfortunately, this reform is tied to the Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act, which would endanger millions of Americans and undermine well-established state laws with respect to concealed carry. Now, my home state of Rhode Island has strong, sensible procedures for getting a concealed carry permit. In Rhode Island, you must be at least 21 years old, trained in gun safety, and must have just cause to carry a concealed weapon, and domestic abusers are not eligible. H.R. 38 would override these common sense laws, putting our residents at risk. It would allow anyone denied a permit in Rhode Island to permit shop in states with weaker laws, and it would allow residents of states with weaker requirements to carry freely in our neighborhoods. Mr. Speaker, gun violence is an epidemic in this country. We should not be taking steps to put more guns on our streets. I urge my colleagues to heed the warnings of law enforcement officers and reject this dangerous bill. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Florida reserves his time. Gentleman from
Reserve.
Georgia.
Speaker.
Gentleman from Georgia reserves his time. Gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Colorado, my good friend, Mr. Perlmutter.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Hastings, I can't think of a more breathtaking display of nerve or brass than what the Republican majority is doing with this bill. After the tragedies we've suffered in Las Vegas and in Orlando, in Aurora, Colorado, that I represented, to race to the bottom, to have the easiest laws, and no offense to Georgia, but Georgia has no business and no right to tell Colorado what its laws concerning the health, safety, and welfare of Coloradans should be under the 10th Amendment. Instead of taking up real legislation on assault weapons or bump stocks that make those assault weapons machine guns that mowed down all those people in Las Vegas, we're saying no. Whatever state has the weakest, most lax gun laws, then that state is going to control all the other states. That's wrong, that's unconstitutional, and this bill should be rejected right here and right now, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Florida reserves his time. Gentleman from Georgia.
Reserve.
Reserves his time. Gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, if we defeat the previous question, I'm going to offer an amendment to the rule to bring up H.R. 3440, the DREAM Act. Mr. Speaker, a group of 34 of my Republican colleagues sent a letter this week to Speaker Ryan urging a vote before the year's end on legislation that would protect DACA recipients. I ask unanimous consent to include that record in the record.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to insert the text of my amendment in the record along with extraneous material immediately prior to the vote on the previous question.
Without objection.
And to discuss our proposal, I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Arizona, Mr.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you. Let me thank my esteemed colleague for yielding. Mr. Speaker, each day that Congress delays action on the DREAM Act, 122 people lose their temporary protected status granted by DACA. Since the Trump September 5th announcement, 11,182 young people have lost their DACA status and face the daily threat of being detained and deported. Time and time again, House Democrats have pleaded to Republicans and their leadership the urgency of finding a legislative solution that will permanently protect dreamers. We have pleaded and explained the economic benefit, $23 billion yearly contributed by dreamers to the GDP of this nation. We have pleaded with the leadership, Republican leadership, to bring the DREAM Act to the House floor that is just and fair without the trappings of xenophobia, division, or hate. We have pleaded that the dreamers have not committed a crime. It was not an act of volition on their part as children. We must move beyond the political calculations about race, us versus them divisions in this country, and scapegoating. The House has an opportunity to vote on a clean, and the authority to vote on a clean DREAM Act and embrace the shared values and humanity of this nation while rejecting the political manufactured hysteria. I asked a no on the previous question so that H.R. 3440, the DREAM Act, can come to the House floor, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Florida reserves his time. Gentleman from Georgia.
I'm reserved, but I do ask the gentleman from Florida, if I could, Mr. Speaker, how many more speakers?
I do not.
You do not? Well, then I guess we're about ready to close then. If the gentleman from Florida is ready.
All right, I'm ready.
Thanks, sir. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you.
Gentleman from Georgia reserves his time. Gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, I've watched this year as members of the Republican majority have worked diligently to repeal the Affordable Care Act, which would have been a failure for the American people, but great for special interests. I've watched members in the Republican majority work relentlessly to push a tax scam bill through this body that will certainly be a failure for the American people, but great for corporate America and the ultra-wealthy. And I've watched members of the Republican majority here today and yesterday in the Rules Committee champion a bill that will be a failure for the American people, especially survivors of domestic violence, but great for the powerful corporate gun lobby and gun manufacturers. I sense a theme for my friends across the aisle, and it's a shameful one. Mr. Speaker, our country faces a gun violence epidemic, and we here in Congress should be doing all that we can to put it to an end. The opportunity to pass a bipartisan measure to strengthen our background check system has presented itself, but apparently the majority, without hearings, would rather drown bipartisanship in the dirty waters of the corporate gun lobby and gun manufacturers. I've said it before, and I'll say it again here today. Those who stand in the way of legislation that will address our country's gun violence epidemic are increasingly culpable for its needless continuation. And that's why I dubbed and gave the acronym GOP, Guns Over People, but I guess I should have used the acronym good old puppets of the gun lobby and gun manufacturers. I urge a no vote on the rule and underlying bill and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from Georgia.
Mr. Speaker, I do appreciate the time we have today. I do appreciate my friend from Florida. We have many lively debates on the floor and many lively debates in Rules Committee. But, you know, if you really want to see things going in really a tone and tenor, Mr. Speaker, on this floor, let's at least get back to saying there's ideas that we agree with and disagree with. And there are ideas of actually just taking a constitutional right and being able to apply that in a Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act, which is what we're talking about here, irregardless of who might find that appealing, what groups or non-groups. That's a constitutional right that we're fighting for. But, you know, in this regard of saying that puppets, well, let's, the moment that a group who enjoys killing babies says you need to make sure that right is available, then my friends across the aisle are quick to jump with their strings to say, yes, I want to do that. When they wanted to have government-controlled more health care, they also said, oh, but our insurance companies, we need to have a position for them in which they're taken care of. I guess that was another puppet string, Mr. Speaker. I think the bottom line is let's quit knowing that many of us on both sides, we have our positions, and we have people who like our positions on both sides, whether they be Democrat or Republican. But one of the reasons that the American people are very frustrated with this body is because the tone and tenor is not on policy, which we can disagree on. It is who controls the other. And if we wanted to lay out a laundry list of supporters of the Democratic Party and maybe supporters of the Republican Party and say that's all that matters, then fine, Mr. Speaker. If we've denigrated to that, then so be it, but shame on us. Whether you want reciprocity or not, good. Argue it. Whether you want to have another thing with our tax reform and you believe tax reform can be done a different way, argue it. But when we denigrate out to who is puppets and who is not, then we're also racing to the bottom. We're racing to the bottom of a civil discourse that the American people are tired of. Look in the last election. So when I look at this today, Mr. Speaker, I look at a bill, and we've also heard interesting things that have been said, like officers will be in trouble and possibly can be sued. Look, if what language was put into the bill was Terry stops that they could ask and that they're protected from suit. What they're not protected from is unlawful arrest or unlawful time in these, then they will be held liable. Or maybe it's also been said that we're going to turn all these concealed carry permit owners like myself and my friend from Florida, we're going to turn them loose on the country. And terrible things are going to happen. May I remind us here on the floor that Florida, which has issued nearly 2 million permits, have only revoked 168 due to gun crimes committed by permit holders. That's 0.008%. The fact that concealed carry permit holders are generally more law-abiding than the general public. We can disagree, Mr. Speaker, and that's part of this body. We can come to different conclusions. That's the reason we have a debate floor. But when we start to try and bring in other things and who's controlled by who, then I just simply, Mr. Speaker, ask that the other side cut their strings first. With that, I yield back the balance of my time and move the previous question.
Gentleman yields back his time, moves the previous question. The question is on ordering the previous question on the resolution. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, I ask for the yeas and nays.
For the yeas and nays, those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to House Resolution 645, I call up the bill H.R. 38, the Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act of 2017, and ask for its immediate consideration.
Will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar number 320, H.R. 38, a bill to amend Title 18, United States Code, to provide a means by which non-residents of a state whose residents may carry concealed firearms may also do so in the state.
Pursuant to House Resolution 645, in lieu of the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on the Judiciary printed in the bill, an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 115-45 is adopted, and the bill as amended is considered read. The bill shall be debatable for 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking member of the Committee on the Judiciary. The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Goodlatte, and the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nedler, each will control 30 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on H.R. 38.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
I rise in strong support of H.R. 38, the Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act of 2017.
The House will be in order. Gentleman may resume.
Mr. Speaker, throughout my career in elected office, I have believed in and adhered to 2 fundamental principles regarding firearms policy. First, the right guaranteed to law-abiding Americans by the Second Amendment must be aggressively protected and preserved. Second, the laws we have on the books need to be enforced to the fullest extent possible. The bipartisan bill before us today does both. H.R. 38 ensures that law-abiding citizens' Second Amendment right does not end when they cross state lines. Mr. Speaker, the House is not in order.
The House will be in order. Please take all conversations to the cloakrooms or off the floor. The gentleman from Virginia.
The bill allows law-abiding gun owners with valid state-issued concealed carry firearm permits to, or those who live in so-called constitutional carry states, to carry a concealed firearm in any other state that also allows concealed carry. We know that citizens who carry a concealed firearm are not only better prepared to act in their own self-defense, but also in the defense of others. Take, for instance, an incident that occurred just last November on a highway in Florida. Lee County Sheriff's Deputy Dean Bards had just concluded a high-speed chase just off Interstate 75. As Deputy Bards approached to apprehend the suspect, Edward Struther, violently attacked Deputy Bards. A witness on the scene told reporters that the attacker just started punching him and hitting and hitting and hitting. I was afraid for the police officer. I thought he was going to kill him. Fortunately for Deputy Bards, Ashad Russell, a Florida concealed carry permit holder, was also watching the attack unfold. Mr. Russell pulled his gun and approached the altercation. He told Struther he would shoot him if he didn't stop beating the deputy. The state attorney's office says Struther ignored Russell's commands to stop beating the deputy, so Russell fired his gun 3 times, hitting and fatally wounding the assailant. Lee County Sheriff Mike Scott has hailed Russell as a hero. Importantly, this bill also contains the Fix NICS Act of 2017. This is a bipartisan and bicameral measure. The Fix NICS Act takes steps to ensure that state and federal agencies enter all relevant records into the FBI's National Instant Criminal Background Check System. This bill will help ensure people who are legally prohibited from having guns, like those with violent felony convictions, do not obtain them. The shooting at Virginia Tech and the church shootings in Charleston, South Carolina, and Sutherland Springs, Texas, are tragic reminders of what can happen when all relevant records are not entered into the system. Our NICS system is only as good as the information within it. This important piece of legislation will ensure that more of the information already required to be uploaded to NICS under current law is actually placed in the NICS system. Taken together, the Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act and the Fix NICS Act preserve and protect the right guaranteed to us by the Second Amendment and ensure that those prohibited by existing law from receiving a firearm are prevented from doing so. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this legislation. I want to thank the lead sponsor, Mr. Hudson of North Carolina, for his hard work on this bill. And I would also like to thank the authors of the Fix NICS provisions, Mr. Culberson and Mr. Cuellar, for their important contributions to the legislation before us today, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Virginia reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong opposition to the Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act, this bill would not protect us from gun violence, but would make us far less safe. Under current law, each state makes its own determination about who may carry a concealed firearm in public, including deciding which other states' concealed carry permits to recognize. This bill would eviscerate the core public safety determinations that each state makes concerning the concealed carrying of guns in public based on the unique circumstances of each state and the desires of its citizens. In fact, the standards and requirements adopted in the states vary dramatically. 31 states and D.C. require gun safety training to carry concealed guns in public, and 21 of those states require live fire training. 27 states and the District of Columbia prohibit individuals convicted of misdemeanor crimes of violence from concealed carry. 28 states and D.C. prohibit convicted stalkers from carrying concealed guns. 34 states and D.C. prohibit those under 21 years of age from carrying concealed guns. Many states prohibit gun possession and concealed carry by abusive dating partners, exceeding federal protections against abusive spouses. All of these states would have their carefully considered laws governing concealed carry overridden by this bill. The obvious solution to the varying state laws is to continue to do what is currently done by many states, which is to choose which other state permits they will recognize. Some states, including my state of New York, have chosen not to recognize permits issued by any other state. Most states, however, have chosen to recognize permits from at least some other states, basing the choice on the strength and standards employed by the other states. We should not disregard these determinations, which is what this bill would do. Instead, this bill would say that every state must honor the concealed carry permit of every other state. About 10 states don't have any requirements and issue a concealed carry permit upon request to anyone. And what this bill would do, in effect, is to say that if New York or Illinois have strict requirements for concealed carry, if someone comes in from a state that doesn't, they have to let that person have concealed carry in their state. In effect, it uses the power of the federal government to import the laws of one state and make them enforceable in the other state. In addition, I am deeply disappointed that the version of this bill before us today includes the bipartisan Fix NICS Act, a measure that should be enacted as a standalone bill without delay, and that was reported as a separate bill by the Judiciary Committee. That bill would take steps to address shortcomings with the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, or what we often call the NICS. As the recent mass shooting at the church in Sutherland Springs, Texas illustrates, we must do more to ensure all relevant prohibiting records are submitted to the databases that comprise the NICS. No one should pass a firearm background check that he or she should have failed simply because their record of a felony conviction or domestic violence record or some other prohibition under federal law was not included in the system. There is broad bipartisan support for the Fix NICS bill here in the House and in the Senate. That proposal, which would actually save lives, should not be tethered to the forced concealed carry reciprocity provisions of this bill, which would only serve to endanger our citizens. The answer to our national problem of gun violence is not that we need more people carrying concealed firearms on our streets. More than 33,000 Americans lose their lives to gun violence every year, while in some other countries this figure barely exceeds 100. In 2011, the United Kingdom had 146 deaths due to gun violence. Denmark, 71. Portugal, 142. Japan, just 30. The United States, over 30,000. A study in the American Journal of Medicine found that compared to 22 other high-income countries, the gun-related murder rate in the United States is 25 times higher. The common factor in all of these other countries is the availability, is the lack of such easy availability of guns. Our country, however, is awash in guns, and we have the shameful death toll to show for it. Sadly, this bill will only increase it. We must change our approach to gun violence and adopt meaningful legislation that strengthens our gun laws instead of weakening them. And we must not undermine the efforts of states to defend their citizens against these harms. Unfortunately, the dangers posed by the concealed carry reciprocity portion of this bill greatly outweigh the benefits of the NICS improvements. Therefore, I oppose H.R. 38. I urge my colleagues to reject it today. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time it's my pleasure to yield 4 minutes to the lead sponsor of the legislation, the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Hudson.
The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me tell you a story. It's a story about an African-American single mother, 2 kids, living in South Philly. After twice being the victim of muggings, she decides to go out and legally purchase a firearm to protect herself, gets trained with her weapon, and applies for a concealed carry permit. Sometime thereafter, she crossed the state line into New Jersey, and at a routine traffic stop did exactly as she was trained, handed her driver's license and her concealed carry permit to the police officer and let him know that she had a pistol in her purse. What she didn't know is that the state of New Jersey doesn't recognize the concealed carry permits of their neighbor in Pennsylvania. And so this poor single mother, who's never had a brush with the law, spent almost 50 days in jail and was looking at 10 years in prison. Are you serious? We have to make sure that never happens again. The other side today is going to argue that we're violating states' rights with this legislation. But Article 4, Section 1, the full faith and credit clause of the Constitution, says very clearly that every state should give the full faith and credit to the judicial proceedings and documents of every other state, and that Congress has a responsibility to determine how those documents will be recognized. That's why a driver's license is recognized in every state. That's why if I get married in North Carolina but I move to Arizona, I'm not a single man again. They recognize that marriage. That's why divorce decrees are recognized in every state. The concealed carry permit should be recognized the same way. But this is not trampling states' rights, because states can still determine what can be carried, where it can be carried. They can set any kind of limits they want about how weapons are carried in their municipalities or their states. For example, if you visit the state of New York, they have a limit on the size of a magazine on a pistol. You've got to follow that law. If they want to set restrictions about places where you can't carry, even with this legislation, that law would have to be followed. The states retain this right, just like a driver's license. The other side's also going to stand up and claim all kinds of doomsday scenarios about how we're going to increase crime, we're going to increase the number of weapons out there, we're going to turn the cities into the Wild West. I find it ironic that we're being lectured to by people from big cities with a lot of gun control measures, but have some of the worst crime in the nation. They're worried about people coming from other places where we don't have crime. I think that's ironic. But the truth is, over half the states already recognize permits from every other state. 19 states, in fact, already do this. States and municipalities, as I mentioned, retain the right to restrict where guns are carried in their communities, even under this legislation. And if you look at the empirical evidence, places where you have concealed carry, even constitutional carry, when you instituted this right, violent crime went down, gun crime went down. You've seen less crime, not more crime. There was actually a study done in Florida and Texas, and it showed that off-duty police officers commit crimes more than concealed carry permit holders. Think about that. Police officers don't commit crimes very often, but even they commit crimes more than concealed carry permit holders. These are not the people we're worried about. These are not the violent criminals that we're worried about in our cities. This is a common sense measure that upholds our constitutional right. It makes sure that a law-abiding citizen trying to do the right thing doesn't become a criminal simply because they've crossed that line. And so for every freedom-loving American who exercises their Second Amendment right, today is your day. For the 73% of Americans who support concealed carry, today is your day. For the 15 million concealed carry permit holders out there, today is your day. And finally, to the single mothers out there who just want to protect themselves and their families, today is your day. I thank the chairman for his leadership on this. I ask my colleagues to join me in supporting this common sense legislation. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Virginia.
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York.
Thank you. I now yield 3 minutes to the distinguished gentlelady from Texas, the ranking member of the Crime Subcommittee, Ms. Jackson Lee.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Let me thank the ranking member for yielding. And let me say that the problems that my good friend just mentioned on the floor can be solved by real, sensible gun safety legislation, unfortunately, H.R. 38 is not that. And it is not that because it has ignored the pleas of law enforcement, and it has ignored the rational addition of amendments that would save lives. H.R. 38 is dangerous, it's reckless, and it's secretly packaged a fix to gun violence but instead, it's laced with lethal elements of catastrophic proportion. Then in the midnight hour, it matches the NIC fix dealing with the background check with the concealed carry reciprocity. That is patently unfair, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker. Then it would not allow reasonable amendments. Exposing victims of domestic violence, an amendment that I had, it will expose them to victims of domestic violence, to stalkers and those who have been involved in domestic violence, to gun violence or death. It will entice those who perpetrate hate crimes. It will add to the current alarming death rate. Unfortunately, where we could have fixed the NICS Act, it does not do that. 556 women have been murdered this year alone by intimate partners with firearms. My amendment would have made this bill safer on the concealed carry bill. Didn't want to have it. Other 14 sensible amendments were blocked. 4.5 million American women alive today have been threatened by abusers. Hate crimes. Those worshipers in Charleston, South Carolina, were killed by a person who came there with hate. My amendment dealing with not allowing someone convicted of a hate crime. Even though they say that that is the federal law, why not have it in this underlying bill where so many people are killed? Let me give you an example. Under the Brady campaign, 114,994 Americans are killed by guns. They include those in Las Vegas. They include those at the Pulse nightclub in Charlottesville, Charleston rather. Those who marched in Charlottesville with all the violence that they had, and of course, Sandy Hook. 17,000 children are gunned down by guns. The laws of different states, 12 states, have an open carry law with no rules. That means that if you're in Washington, D.C., where heads of state and other dignitaries come, then recklessly someone can come on the streets. Do we even listen to police officers? The Major Chiefs Association has indicated that they're opposed to H.R. 38 because it will require those making legitimate legal stops as law enforcement officers seeking to come home to their families, being subjected to individuals whose documents they may not know are credible or whether they're fraudulent or whether in fact these individuals legitimately should have a gun. I can't understand why this is not understood.
The gentlelady's time has expired.
That it is
the gentlelady's time has
usually
expired.
understood that we respect the constitutionality of states. This is a bad bill. It ignores sovereignty, and we should vote it down because too many people are murdered by guns without safety regulations. I yield back.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself 15 seconds, and I will submit for the record an article entitled "Good Samaritan Kills Active Shooter in Texas Sports Bar," in which a shooter with 2 guns and 2 knives entered a sports bar and was shot by an individual that the police labeled a Good Samaritan who happened to be eating at the restaurant with his wife. He was a concealed carry permit holder. He told his wife to get down on the ground, and then he shot the assailant.
It'll be inserted into the record.
Mr. Speaker, it's now my pleasure to yield to the chairman of the Crime Subcommittee of the House Judiciary Committee, the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Sensenbrenner. 3 minutes.
The gentleman from Wisconsin has 3 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the gentleman for yielding. I am pleased that H.R. 38 as amended includes the Fixed NICS Act. I have long supported the National Instant Check System, or NICS. NICS is about saving lives and protecting people from harm by preventing guns from falling into the wrong hands. It does this without interfering in the timely transfer of firearms to eligible gun buyers. I was the original co-sponsor of the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act of 1993 and worked diligently for its passage. I strongly supported this bill because it makes sense to prevent convicted felons and individuals judged to be mentally ill from obtaining guns. At the time of negotiations, I insisted on the inclusion of a NICS program. Under this system, firearms dealers use the FBI's NICS system to cross-reference with a list of known convicted felons, drug users, illegal aliens, and those convicted of domestic violence. As I have stated many times, the NICS system is only as good as the records that are put into it. Too often, people who would not pass a background check can slip through the cracks and buy guns. After the recent shooting in Sutherland Springs, Texas, the U.S. Air Force disclosed that it had failed to report the gunman's history of domestic assault to the database, which should have prevented him from purchasing a firearm in the first place. This legislation will provide a much-needed push to speed implementation of the NICS system used in conducting instant background checks prior to gun purchases. At the federal level, it would require federal agency cooperation in providing relevant records to the Attorney General for inclusion into the NICS. It holds federal agencies accountable if they fail to upload relevant records to the background check system through public reporting and prohibiting bonus pay for political appointees. At the state level, it will incentivize them to make sure that their reporting is up to date by giving federal grant preferences to states which comply. Let me be clear. This bill is not about expanding background checks. This is about ensuring that the existing law is working. There is strong bipartisan support for improving what has become a systemic problem of missing information in the database. Accurate reporting is essential to ensuring that the system works as intended. And I urge my colleagues to support this legislation and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. The gentleman for Virginia reserves. The gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, before I recognize the gentlelady from Connecticut, I recognize the gentlelady from Texas for unanimous consent request.
Without objection.
I thank the chairman. I thank the ranking member. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to put in the record, ask unanimous consent. Good guys with guns can be dangerous. 2, don't gut concealed carry laws. Why is Congress about to vote to loosen gun laws again? By Mark Kelly. Major Cities Chiefs Association opposing H.R. 38. Ask unanimous consent. Ask unanimous consent to put in the record the Chief of Police from the City of Houston. Unanimous consent. And finally, I ask to put in the record the national domestic violence report. I ask unanimous consent to put those into the record.
The gentlelady's requests are granted without
Thank
objection.
you.
The gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Connecticut, Ms. Esty.
The gentlelady from Connecticut has 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong opposition to the so-called Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act. It is outrageous that today, of all days, 1 week before the 5-year anniversary of the horrific murder of 20 school children in my district of Newtown, 6 educators, 2 months after the slaughter of 50 Americans watching a concert, that we are about to act on a bill to put more guns in the hands of more dangerous people. Rather than helping raise the standards nationally for gun safety, this bill would override and lower most states' concealed carry laws, making it easier for domestic violence abusers, stalkers, and violent criminals to carry across state lines loaded, hidden guns. This bill should be called the Act to Carry Any Gun, Anywhere, Anytime, by Anyone. The Concealed Carry Reciprocity Bill is an outrage and an insult to the families in Newtown and to the hundreds of families who have lost loved ones to gun violence, who are gathered here today at the Capitol for the 5th annual vigil to end gun violence. In the 5 years since Sandy Hook, this is the very first bill we have been allowed to vote on in this chamber, and it is a reckless giveaway to the moneyed gun interests. Mr. Speaker, since 2012, gun violence has killed over 170,000 Americans. It's time for this House to truly honor the victims of gun violence and their families with action, instead of caving in to the gun lobby yet again. I urge all of my colleagues to oppose this dangerous bill. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, it's now my pleasure to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Poe, a member of the Judiciary Committee.
The gentleman from Texas has 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, history is the great educator. We remember American history. The War of Independence started when the British tried to take away the firearms of Americans, Lexington and Concord. That revolution was successful because Americans were able to be armed. The Texas War of Independence started when the Mexican government tried to take away the firearms of Texans. That started at Gonzales, Texas, and it was successful, and we became an independent country. The Second Amendment is a constitutional right that Americans have. My friends on the other side seem to want, they don't like the Second Amendment. They wish it wasn't there. They do everything in their power to restrict the privilege and the right that we have under the Second Amendment, and we get it because of our history, to protect us from government and also for self-defense. My friends talk about gun violence. You got to remember, the gun violence happens in many times where people are disarmed, and it usually takes a gun to stop that gun, just like it did at the church in Texas. Another situation, if I were to drive my Jeep to California, and I get stopped by the California Highway Patrol, which maybe would occur, I would show them my Texas driver's license, and then they would let me drive, even though the laws in California are different on driver's licenses. Second, my registration of my Jeep in Texas would pass in California, even though if I had to get it done in California, it probably wouldn't pass. But they recognize that because we have laws that recognize that. My marriage license would be acceptable as well. The right to bear arms, the right to have a concealed carry weapon is based on the Second Amendment of the Constitution. This law, all it does is allow us to exercise that right in every state. And that's just the way it is. I'll yield back.
Gentleman from Texas yields back. The gentleman from Virginia reserves. The gentleman from New York.
How much time? 3 minutes. Mr. Speaker, I now yield 3 minutes to the distinguished Democratic whip, Mr. Hoyer.
Democratic whip is recognized for 3 minutes.
I want to thank Mr. Nadler for yielding. Mr. Speaker, that's just the way it is. Since the start of 2017, more than 14,340 people have been killed by gun violence in the United States, more than any other country on earth. That's just the way it is. More than 29,150 have been wounded. More than 680 of those have been children. In October, 58 people were killed and 515 wounded in Las Vegas in the worst mass shooting in our nation's history. But we don't have a bill on the floor to prevent the creation of machine guns, which are illegal by bump stocks. Just 5 weeks later, a gunman entered a church in Sutherland Springs, Texas, and killed 26 worshipers while wounding 20. The majority's response? Bring to the floor a bill that makes America less safe, more replete with people carrying and concealing weapons in our communities. This bill says if you want to carry a concealed weapon in a state that doesn't allow it constitutionally, no problem. Get your concealed carry license in another state that does. In other words, every state, no matter their own judgment, talk about states' rights, no matter their own judgment, must be subjected to the policies of the least protective state in the nation. Instead of addressing the very serious problem of rampant gun violence in a constructive way, the Republican majority is bringing to the floor a bill that makes it easier to hide dangerous weapons in public. Newtown, Aurora, Orlando, Las Vegas, Sutherland Springs, and community after community after community What will it take for this Congress to act? What will it take to face this challenge instead of ignoring it? How many more will not live to see the new year or begin it with debilitating injuries they will carry for the rest of their lives? How many times will we have a moment of silence and a year of no action? Defeat this bill. Its rational provision of NICS, making sure people report, does not justify the danger it expands. Support the rights of states to protect their residents from hidden firearms. Do not ignore the crisis that confronts our country. Have a moment of action, a moment of legislating more safety, not less, not simply a few seconds of silence to lament the loss of life, whether it be in Las Vegas or Orlando or in our own communities. Defeat this bill. Come back and do some positive, constructive work that makes America safe again.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself 15 seconds to submit to the record a letter signed by 23 of those states' attorneys general who say, in part in this letter, strong evidence indicates that concealed carry permit holders actually deter and reduce crime. This is taking action by passing this legislation. And now it is, I will not yield to the gentleman. We have limited time.
My presumption is the Maryland Attorney General is not one of those signatories.
The gentleman's request will be put into the record. The gentleman from Virginia.
I thank the Speaker. It's now my pleasure to yield to the gentlewoman from Alabama, Ms. Roby, 2 minutes.
The gentleman from Alabama has 2 minutes.
A member of the Judiciary Committee.
I thank my chairman. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 38, the Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act of 2017. Our founders laid out certain rights in our Constitution, not to empower the government, but to empower the people. Certainly among the most fundamental of those rights we have as Americans is to keep and bear arms. H.R. 38, the Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act of 2017, simply ensures all law-abiding citizens who meet the requirements to obtain concealed carry permits in their home states can exercise the right to protect themselves in any state, provided that they obey the local concealed carry laws. Mr. Speaker, some opponents of this bill claim that we are somehow making it easier for dangerous, unqualified individuals to obtain and carry guns. That is absolutely not true. If a citizen is currently prohibited from purchasing or possessing a firearm, this bill does nothing to change that. On the other hand, Mr. Speaker, others will tell you that we are making it harder for law-abiding Americans to exercise their Second Amendment right. That's not true either. H.R. 38 does nothing to infringe upon anyone's right to keep and bear arms. The bill simply ensures that our current National Instant Criminal Background Check System, or NICS, is enforced and working properly. Those of us who respect the Second Amendment and dedicate our careers to defending it will always fight to protect this fundamental right from those who would erode it. But, Mr. Speaker, we also have a responsibility to uphold and enforce our current laws to ensure dangerous people can't obtain weapons. In fact, it is precisely because we want to preserve our Second Amendment rights that we must ensure our criminal background check system works properly. I urge my colleagues to support this bill in order to ensure that those who obtain a concealed carry permit in one state are able to enjoy the freedom in any state to make sure our current background check system is working the way it was intended to work. Thank you. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Virginia reserves. The gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen.
Gentleman from Tennessee, 1 minute.
Thank you, sir. Firstly, the NRA put a bulletin out, urged people to vote for this. They said we must ensure that gun jurisdictions do not harass travelers. That's the purpose of this bill from the NRA, that anti-gun jurisdictions, state legislatures that have restrictive gun laws, cannot harass travelers, cannot see that their state has the same laws that their citizens have from people out of state. When my friends on the other side talk about being concerned about the Second Amendment and dedicating their lives to it and seeing that irresponsible people don't get guns, when we tried to bring a no-fly, no-buy law, they weren't for it. They talked about due process. But if they brought a due process bill to the floor for people who are on the no-fly list, no. Social Security, people on Social Security who can't manage their own affairs, they passed a law that says they should get guns when they couldn't before. That's not in keeping with what they're saying. This bill violates states' rights, puts guns in hands of people that states don't want to have it in. 7 states don't allow people under 21, unless they're in the military, to have a gun permit. This federal law would override those 7 states. This is a bad law. It's the NRA's law. We should have had amendments considered in committee,
Gentleman's time
reasonable
has
amendments,
expired.
but we didn't because the NRA didn't want them. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, at this time, it's my pleasure to yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Farenthold, a member of the Judiciary Committee.
Gentleman from Texas, 1.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker, I'm here today to support the Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act, which will allow a person who's licensed in one state to carry their firearm to carry it in other states. It works just like your driver's license. My Texas driver's license lets me drive in Virginia, it lets me drive in Florida, it lets me drive in California. And I tell you, when I was a child growing up in Texas, my family taught me the importance of marksmanship, gun safety, and the Second Amendment. I've long said that when it comes to reducing violence, it's the individual, not the weapon, that we need to be focused on. This bill helps ensure Americans' right to carry is not infringed on when crossing state lines, enhancing public safety. In fact, as the chairman stated earlier on here today, a peer-reviewed study shows that states with more restrictive concealed carry laws had higher gun-related murder rates. That's why we need an armed citizenry to protect ourselves and each other. As we saw in the terrible Texas church shooting in Sutherland Springs just recently, the death toll could have been much higher had not an armed citizen be there to confront the gunman. There are those who insist this bill will arm the criminals, but those claims are far from true, as gun laws restricting criminals from access to weapons are already there in their home states. They're going to remain undisturbed. I'm a strong supporter of the Second Amendment and the Constitution, as I suspect most of y'all are, Mr. Speaker, and I believe gun control is hitting what you aim at and nothing else. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Virginia reserves. The gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Deutsch.
Gentleman from Florida has 2 minutes.
I thank my friend for yielding. Mr. Speaker, it's been almost 5 years to the day that 26 and 7-year-old babies were slaughtered in Newtown. It's been about 1.5 years since 49 people were killed in my home state of Florida, 58 more being injured. In October, 59 people were killed and 500 injured at an outdoor concert in Las Vegas. And in November, 26 people were killed and 20 injured as they worshiped in Sutherland Springs, Texas. The response to all of this tragedy is a bill to make it easier for people to carry concealed weapons in every corner of this country. I don't know whose idea, other than the gun corporations, I don't know whose idea it was that this would be the way that we honor the memories of those who've been killed. That instead of common sense gun safety legislation that the overwhelming majority of people in this country support, we get a bill to make it possible to carry concealed weapons in every state, in every corner of this country. And when my friends on the other side say this doesn't override any laws, that's absolutely untrue. In states that have state laws that govern where you can and can't carry a gun, this bill overrides that and says you can bring any gun into the state.
whatever your regulations are about what you carry, what you can carry. This is a bill that doesn't make us safer, it doesn't make us stronger, but make no mistake, it makes the bottom line, the profits of the gun makers in this country, a little bit healthier. And as we enter the Christmas season, and we think about the 26 and 7-year-old kids whose lives were taken 5 years ago today, whose parents, whose families suffer every day with that loss, whose kids aren't there to receive Christmas presents, I ask my friends on the other side, why is it that we respond to that by giving this enormous
Gentleman's time has
Christmas
expired.
gift to the NRA? I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself 15 seconds to submit for the record 2 articles, one from Tennessee and one from Florida, in which concealed carry permit holders stopped dead in their tracks people who were going to commit murder.
The gentleman from Virginia's request is granted.
Mr. Speaker, it's now my pleasure to yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gates, a member of the Judiciary Committee.
Gentleman from Florida, 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding. And I don't know why Democrats are so afraid to allow people to exercise the full extent of their constitutional rights. In my state, we've got 1.7 million concealed carry permit holders. And concealed carry permit holders in Florida are 8 times less likely to commit crimes than members of law enforcement. I think the American people see that if they had their way, we would take the bad acts of people who break the law and we would use that as an excuse to deprive law-abiding people of the full exercise of their rights. And so I rise in support of the Constitution and to correct a common mistake. The rights that are enumerated in the Constitution are not granted to the American people by government. These are God-given rights, and it is government's duty to protect them for all citizens. But for too long, the government has failed to protect the Constitution and has stripped law-abiding citizens of their freedom. States recognize driver's licenses from other states, but nowhere in the Constitution are they mentioned, yet states routinely deny carry permits from other states, including neighboring states, even though the Constitution explicitly states that the right of people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Mr. Hudson's good bill restores constitutional liberty. I'm proud to join in sponsoring this legislation and to stand with the Constitution and against those who wish to dismantle it. I encourage my colleagues to remember the oath that they swore to uphold and defend the Constitution, and I would encourage them to vote yes on House Resolution 38. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Florida yields, and the gentleman from Virginia reserves. The gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I yield to the gentleman from Rhode Island for the unanimous consent request.
Mr. Speaker, I'd ask unanimous consent. My friends on the other side of the aisle have made a number of arguments about how if everyone has a concealed weapon, America will be safer. I'd ask unanimous consent to submit 2 studies which directly rebut that. A 2017 Stanford University study found that in states that adopted the most permissive concealed carry laws, violent crime is 13 to 15% higher than it would have been had the state retained a more restrictive law. And a 2017 study by researchers at Boston University found that states with shall issue laws had a 10.6% higher handgun homicide rate, consistent with the results of the Stanford study. I ask that both of those empirical studies that disprove the claim that we make America safer if everyone carries a hidden loaded firearm be made a part of the record.
Without objection, the gentleman from Rhode Island's request is granted, and the gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now yield 1.5 minutes to the distinguished chairman of the Democratic Caucus, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Crowley.
Gentleman from New York.
I thank the gentleman. I must have missed something in my religious training. Were there 11 amendments? Were there 11 commandments by God? I know about the first 10, but I missed that 11th one, that thou shalt have the ability to bear arms. I missed that one, that God-given right. Was it a God-given right for someone to take that God-given right and execute 58 people at a concert? Was that a God-given right? Mr. Speaker, the American people have spoken with nearly a unanimous voice. They want Congress to keep their families safe by passing common sense gun safety legislation. Legislation that will keep guns out of the hands of criminals. Protections that will keep those who want to cause terror in our churches, in our schools, at concerts, in our communities from getting those firearms. The bill before us does the exact opposite. It would force states like New York to weaken their own gun safety laws and allow concealed carry. It puts families like yours and mine at risk. And for what? To appease the NRA? That's shameful. In the 66 days since the Las Vegas massacre, Congress has done nothing, absolutely nothing, to address the clear loopholes in our laws that allow one man to kill and injure so many. 66 days since numerous Republicans denounced the bump stocks and promised to fix, only to turn around and do this bill. At a time when we've seen one horrific mass shooting after another, Republicans are forcing through a bill that would put each and every American in harm's way. What's more, this egregious proposal comes days before the 5th anniversary of the tragic shooting at Sandy Hook. This will put us in further danger of another Las Vegas, another Orlando, and another Sandy Hook. The American people are sick.
Gentleman's time has expired.
This. They want this Congress to protect them, not enable criminals.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, may I ask how much time is remaining on each side?
The gentleman from Virginia has 11 3/4 minutes, and the gentleman from New York has 13 minutes. The chair will remind all persons in the gallery that they are here as guests of the House and that any manifestation of approval or disapproval of proceedings is in violation of the rules of the House. Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, at this time it's my pleasure to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Rutherford, a member of the Judiciary Committee.
Gentleman from Florida has 2 minutes.
Thank you for yielding, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker, in my 41 years of law enforcement, 12 years as a sheriff of Duval County, Florida, I can tell you I have seen many, many times where good law-abiding citizens use legal firearms to stop dangerous people from harming them, their loved ones, and even their neighbors. Mr. Speaker, as a law enforcement professional, I want good people carrying firearms. The Fraternal Order of Police that represents thousands of officers all across the United States of America supports good people carrying firearms. You know why? Because we know, as law enforcement officers, we understand that our agencies, our priority one response time target is 7 minutes. In a life and death situation, we target getting there in 7 minutes. That's in a well-policed community. So I want to put Republicans, Democrats, everyone on notice that for that 7 minutes, you better be prepared to protect yourself. So if an active shooter in a mall, in a school, in a church like we just saw in Sutherland, Texas, is killing people, let's say to the tune of 5 people per minute, that's an average of 35 dead unarmed citizens before the police can even arrive at the scene. Believe me, we want good law-abiding citizens who are authorized to carry firearms to have the ability to intervene in a violent situation before law enforcement can even arrive at the scene. We need the Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act to ensure that these good law-abiding citizens can retain the constitutional right to bear arms, legally cross state lines, and hopefully be able to stop a violent incident. Mr. Speaker, none of our other constitutional rights stop at a state line, and our Second Amendment rights should not stop at that line either. I strongly encourage my colleagues to support H.R. 38 and save lives. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Virginia reserves. The gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Cicilline.
Gentleman from Rhode Island, yes, 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. We've just heard some of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle speak about the God-given right to apparently carry a concealed loaded firearm across state lines. What about the God-given right to live, to stay alive, to be free from gun violence in this country? We now have seen the 2 deadliest shootings in American history. 20 children slaughtered 5 years ago at Sandy Hook. And the list goes on and on. Our Republican colleagues will do nothing about it. They won't pass universal background checks. They won't pass no-fly, no-buy to keep terrorists from being able to buy a gun. They won't prevent bump stocks. But they're finally rising up to do something. And what is their answer? Let everyone in America carry a concealed, loaded firearm. Even people who are violent criminals, stalkers, domestic abusers can carry a concealed firearm. And make no mistake about it, this legislation allows someone to go online. You don't have to be a resident of the state that has no protections. You don't have to have training. You don't have to. You can be a criminal. You don't have to have any other permit. Go online and you get a permit in that state. You don't have to be a resident. You don't even have to go there. And you can then travel America with a loaded, concealed firearm and overrule the will of the people of that state through their legislature to impose responsible limitations on it. It also endangers police officers who can be sued for having the audacity to ask someone if they actually have a permit and detain them. They have a cause of action against the police officer and attorney's fees. Unprecedented. This is the response to a country that is pleading for responsible gun safety legislation, that is living with the carnage of gun violence and asking this Congress, do something about it. Protect us from this violence. And our Republican colleagues muster up the courage to pay homage to the NRA and make it easier to sell guns so that people can carry concealed loaded firearms all across this country. Shame on you. Shame on you. You have a responsibility to work with us to protect our constituents from gun violence, to enact sensible gun safety legislation that will reduce the incidence of gun violence. This will make it worse. The claim that somehow it makes it safer is refuted by all of the empirical evidence. You know it is. This is about the
Gentleman's
gun lobby.
time has expired.
Shame on the Republicans.
And the gentleman should be reminded to direct, and other members, to direct their comments to the chair.
Shame on the Republicans.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, at this time it's my pleasure to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Johnson, a member of the Judiciary Committee.
Gentleman from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I rise in strong support of H.R. 38, the Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act of 2017. Our constitutional right to keep and bear arms should not be confined by state lines. Yet currently, a person who has legally obtained a concealed carry permit in one state can be denied that right by simply crossing the state's border. Consider my own home state of Louisiana. Our laws rightfully allow for licensed carrying of concealed firearms. I'm a concealed carry permit holder myself. When a Louisianian leaves the state, however, our valid concealed carry handgun permit becomes void, absent an agreement from the state we may be in or traveling through. The Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act that we vote upon today ensures that law-abiding citizens with a concealed carry permit are not denied their Second Amendment right simply because they travel to other states. The Constitution should know no such bound. It does so while also recognizing states' rights by clearly noting that concealed carry holders must follow the law of each and every jurisdiction. As a constitutional law attorney myself, it's critically important to me that the fundamental right of every law-abiding citizen to keep and bear arms is protected. And yes, this legislation is about preserving our God-given freedoms. It's about public safety, and it's about common sense. As noted, our letter by 23 states' attorneys general, including my own home state of Louisiana, affirms that concealed carry laws deter crime. And as my friend and colleague Sheriff Rutherford just said here so well, he reminded us that law enforcement wants the good guys to be armed. The Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act protects our Second Amendment right, and I encourage my colleagues to support this important legislation. I want to thank Congressman Hudson for introducing H.R. 38 and Chairman Goodlatte for advancing this legislation through our House Judiciary Committee. I'm proud to be a part of this historic legislation. With that, I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Virginia reserves. The gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin.
Gentleman from Maryland has 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Nadler, there have been 914 cases of non-self-defense killings by private citizens holding permits to carry concealed loaded handguns in the last 10 years, which translates into 1,119 Americans dead by homicide, mass shooting, suicide, and murder of police officers under concealed carry permit laws in the states. In Florida, for example, I saw my friend Mr. Rutherford up there. In August, concealed handgun permit holder Everett Miller shot and killed 2 Kissimmee, Florida police officers. Now, if you want to give everybody the right to a concealed carry permit in your state, fine, but don't impose that on the people of Maryland. We've got our own laws. Thank you. Since January, we've had 397 gun massacres in America, defined as a slaying of 4 people or more. 2 of them, Las Vegas, which left 58 people dead, and Sutherland Springs massacre, which left 26 people dead, are among the 10 worst massacres in American history by gun. The American people want to end this reign of terror, but what do our friends do on the other side? Do they bring us the universal criminal background check legislation favored by more than 90% of the American people of every political party to plug the gun show loophole, the internet loophole, the 7-Eleven parking lot loophole? No. Do they bring us to the floor the bill to criminalize bump stocks, which they promised to us? No, no such luck. Instead, they bring forward a bill that would wipe out the vast majority of concealed carry laws in the United States of America, trampling states' rights and wrecking all of the painstaking work of legislatures all over the land, dragging us down to the most lax and permissive state laws in the country. It's not a race to the bottom, it's a plunge to the bottom they've engineered here. This fraudulently named bill has nothing to do with reciprocity because states already have the power to negotiate reciprocity agreements, and 22 of them have it. Your bill destroys reciprocity. Your bill brings us down to the level of the lowest, most permissive laws in the country. My state doesn't give concealed carry permits to domestic abusers, to violent offenders, and dangerously unstable people. A dozen states—
Gentleman's time has expired.
Don't drag us down to the lowest level. Protect states' rights. Thank you.
Gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, at this time it's my pleasure to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Culberson.
Gentleman from Texas has 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The difference of opinion on this bill vividly illustrates the profoundly different worldview of Democrats versus Republicans. Democrats instinctively trust the government and instinctively distrust individuals. Republicans instinctively distrust the government and trust the good hearts and good sense of individual Americans to be the best stewards of protecting themselves, their family, their property, and their freedoms. Our founders understood this, and this is why the First Amendment protects our freedom of conscience, and the Second Amendment follows it immediately so that we as free people have the ability to protect ourselves, our freedom of conscience, against the overpowering force of the government. We in Texas enacted in 1995, while I was a member of the Texas House, a concealed carry law, and we've had now over 20 years of data. And people can go to the Department of Texas Public Safety website and look under conviction rates and see that the concealed carry permit holders in Texas over the last 22 years are 21 times less likely to commit a crime than the average Texans. The 7 minutes that Sheriff Rutherford just mentioned to us is a lifetime. If you or your family or your neighbors are at risk of attack or the individual law-abiding American is going to, who is carrying a concealed weapon has had a background check. They've been trained in the use of the weapon and they know the law. We all as Americans should work together to preserve the Second Amendment right of every American to keep and bear arms no matter what state they are in. And I urge members to support this important legislation.
Gentleman from Virginia reserves. The gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Texas, Mr. O'Rourke.
The gentleman from Texas has 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Like so many Texans, I grew up in a household that honored a tradition of gun ownership for hunting, for collection, for sportsmanship, and also honored gun safety. I was taught to shoot by my Uncle Raymond O'Rourke, jail captain, and the chief marksman in the El Paso County Sheriff's Department. I also live in a state that has a license to carry process, which requires safety training, though 18 states do not. Texas requires that someone who has a license to carry be 21 years or older, though 15 states do not. Texas requires that those who abuse their partners not be allowed to have a license to carry. 14 states do not. Texas does not grant licenses to violent offenders, though 22 states do. And Texas does not grant licenses to people convicted of stalking, though 21 other states do. What H.R. 38 does, Mr. Speaker, is it subjects every Texan, every El Pasoan that I represent, to the lowest common denominator in the United States. It will make our state less, not more safe. That is why I oppose H.R. 38, and I ask all my colleagues to join me in doing the same. With that, I yield back to the gentleman from New York.
Gentleman yields. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself 15 seconds to point out that the Attorney General of the state of Texas has signed a letter along with 22 other state attorneys general in support of this legislation and pointing out that authorized permit holders to carry across state lines will not result in an increased risk of crime. Further, strong evidence indicates that concealed carry permit holders actually deter and reduce crime. And speaking of Texas, it's now my pleasure to yield 2 minutes to the lead Democratic co-sponsor of this legislation, the gentleman, Mr. Cuellar. 2 minutes.
The gentleman from Texas has 2 minutes.
For the Fix NICS Act of 2017, I rise in support of this legislation, which has been combined with the Reciprocity Act, which is, again, another section that I support also. On the Fix NICS, I certainly want to thank Senator Cornyn, Representative Culberson, Representative Esty, Costello, Aguilar, for their leadership in this particular issue that we've been working on. A few weeks ago, 26 members of the Sutherland Springs community, which is in my district, were killed by someone who should have never had access to firearms. The investigation into the shooting revealed that the shooter had a criminal history. The Defense Department and the Air Force missed six times in time where the criminal justice process should have reported the history to the NICS database. As of 2016, the Air Force, which should have entered the Sutherland Springs shooter's criminal information, enter a total of one active record in the NICS record. If the Air Force would have met the minimum obligations, the gunman never would have been able to legally purchase a firearm. And this is why we introduced the Fix NICS Act of 2017. This legislation ensures that the federal and state authorities comply with existing laws and accurately report relevant criminal history to report this records to the NICS. It also provides consequences for federal agencies who fail to report the relevant records and ensure that states improve their overall reporting. The Fix NICS Act is an important step in ensuring that people like Sutherland Springs shooter never slip through the cracks of the NICS database again. As to the reciprocity part of it, again, I know that both sides have spoken on that, but again, as a supporter of the Second Amendment, I believe that the Second Amendment doesn't stop at political state lines. It's something that applies. It's part of the U.S. Constitution and should apply across. So again, I rise in support of this legislation, and I ask my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from Virginia reserves, and the gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is now my pleasure to yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from California, the chairman of the Gun Violence Prevention Task Force, Mr. Thompson.
Gentleman is yielded 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yield. Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to this dangerous bill. You know, I asked my local law enforcement what they thought of folks from out of state who don't meet our local requirements coming into our communities with loaded concealed firearms. These are the folks who are on the front lines of fighting gun violence, and we should listen to what they have to say. Our Sonoma County Sheriff opposes this bill and says it would negatively affect our community and put citizens and his deputies in greater danger. The chief of police from my hometown in St. Helena said, as a lifelong proponent of the ability to own, possess, and carry firearms within the provisions of the law, I am wholeheartedly against H.R. 38. Like many of us, he asks, how long will it take before someone who can't meet the legal requirements to concealed carry in California go to some other state with little or no standards and get a permit from that state? Our chief of police in Martinez opposes this bill, and it says it's a race to the bottom. Overwhelmingly, law enforcement in my district strongly oppose this bill. Moreover, there's a reason no major law enforcement organizations have come out in support of this bill. It's dangerous and it's unnecessary. I think my colleagues should stand with law enforcement, the people that keep us and our families safe, and oppose this bill. Every example that was given from my friends across the aisle don't pertain to this bill. They talked about in their states, concealed carry. Their states Texas was the last one. In Texas, there's a standard you have to meet to get a concealed carry permit. If this bill passes, you erase that standard. Somebody from out of state who is a violent criminal can come in with a loaded, concealed firearm in the state of Texas. Someone who is a criminal in the state of Texas, where there are rules, can go to another state, get a concealed carry permit, and bring that loaded, concealed firearm into the state of Texas. This is bad policy. It should be opposed.
Gentleman's time has expired, and the gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, at this time, it's my pleasure to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Dunn.
The gentleman has been yielded 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 38, the Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act. This common sense legislation ensures that our Second Amendment rights don't end when we cross state lines. We are all aware of the story of Shaneen Allen, a mother of 3 who was pulled over in New Jersey after committing a minor traffic violation. She told police legally that she had a handgun on her person and a concealed carry permit. She was unaware that the permit was not transferable to New Jersey, and she had no prior criminal record. Nonetheless, she spent 40 days in a jail cell. Americans like Shaneen are exposed to real risks of accidentally breaking the law of another state simply by exercising their constitutional right. This bill ensures that valid concealed carry permits from one state are valid in all other states. It creates legal protections for law-abiding gun owners against states that violate this statute. Mr. Speaker, I encourage my colleagues to support this important legislation and show that the American people, the Second Amendment, is safe with us. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Virginia reserves. The gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, how much time do we have?
Gentleman from New York has 6 minutes remaining.
What did you think? Okay. Mr. Speaker, I now, it's my pleasure to yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Maloney.
Gentlewoman from New York has 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, we have a gun violence epidemic in this country. It's glaringly obvious to anyone paying attention that our federal gun safety laws are pathetically weak and in major need of improvement. So what is this House doing about it? Working to pass a bill that completely undermines gun safety laws and puts more guns on the street and more lives at risk. Believe me, if more guns made this country safer, we'd be the safest country on earth, and we are far from it. Under this bill, someone who couldn't get a concealed carry permit in New York would be able to carry concealed guns into New York State and any state as long as they had a permit from another state. This completely eviscerates state-level gun safety laws and puts us all at the mercy of the weakest gun safety laws in the country. This bill is opposed by major law enforcement organizations across this country. I urge this body to listen to their advice and vote against this reckless assault on state and local gun safety laws. Thank you.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, at this time, it's my pleasure to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Budd.
Gentleman from North Carolina has 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of Mr. Hudson's Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act. As things stand, each state currently determines its own concealed carry reciprocity laws, and some states don't recognize concealed carry permits from other states. This forces lawful gun owners to sometimes surrender their Second Amendment rights when they're traveling. The current system has created accidental criminals, it's ruined lives, it's punished gun owners simply because they fell victim to complexity and uncertainty in the law. My colleague's bill addresses this problem by bringing much needed clarity to the system. H.R. 38 is a simple proposal, but a necessary one, and if it's enacted, it will allow lawful gun owners to carry their firearm into other states that allow concealed carry. This interstate recognition of concealed carry would be very similar to a driver's license. H.R. 38 would not create national standards for concealed carry Or would it take away a state's right to govern their own concealed carry laws like some might claim? No, this bill simply uses Congress's 14th Amendment power to protect people's constitutional rights from state abuse. Samuel Adams said, and I quote, "The Constitution shall never be construed to prevent the people of the United States who are peaceable citizens from keeping their own arms," end quote.
Gentleman's
This
time has
powerful
expired.
line from Mr. Adams sums up my feelings on this bill much better than I can. I thank Mr. Hudson and the chairman for his steadfast leadership on this issue. I urge adoption, and Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Virginia reserves. The gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Demings.
The gentlelady from Florida, 2 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. One of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle from Florida talked about the 1.7 million concealed weapons permits that are issued in Florida. Well, let me make it quite clear that those permits are issued to Floridians, for Floridians, not to any person from any state at any time who wants to bring a gun into Florida. And different from my colleague, Mr. Speaker, I rise today to advocate for the safety of every American and for the safety of our first responders who are entrusted with that awesome responsibility. As members of Congress, our question should be, what can we all do to make living in America safer? Every day, law enforcement officers risk their lives to keep our communities safe. Last week, I was honored that the House passed the Law Enforcement Mental Health and Awareness Act unanimously. Police officers have a tough job, and I think we can all agree on this point. That job is getting tougher. Mr. Speaker, we must ask ourselves, why would any member, Republican or Democrat, support this legislation that would make a police officer's job harder and more dangerous and open our officers up to personal liability for simply doing their jobs? This reckless piece of legislation would allow persons from outside your state to bring their firearms anywhere, including school zones, without applying the guidelines, laws, restrictions, or oversight of your state. Mr. Speaker, I want you to envision this situation from the perspective of a law enforcement officer. An out-of-state armed individual is stopped by that officer. Maybe that individual's license is legitimate, maybe it's not. The officer is on the side of the road, facing an armed individual trying to figure out whether the individual's permit is authentic, which the officer is obligated to do. If the permit is fake, failing to stop that individual puts the community at risk. If the permit is real, stopping the individual has opened the officer up to potential personal liability. In the last year, I've heard my colleagues on the other side talk about how we should better empower states to decide what's in their own best interest.
The gentlelady's time has expired.
I have additional 30 seconds.
The gentleman from New York yields.
Speaker, I yield the gentlelady an additional 30 seconds.
30 seconds.
Thank you so much. This legislation strips individual states of their power and puts our public safety officers in legal and personal jeopardy. Supporting this legislation is reckless and irresponsible. And as a former chief of police, I urge my colleagues to vote no on H.R. 38. Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
Gentlelady from Florida yields back. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire how much time is remaining on each side?
Gentleman from Virginia has 2 minutes and 30 seconds. And gentleman from New York has 2.5 minutes. 2.5.
Mr. Speaker, at this time, I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Maine, Mr. Poliquin.
Gentleman from Maine has 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker, for generations, Maine families have enjoyed the great outdoors. That means hunting, fishing, camping, hiking. That is part of who we are as a people. That's part of our way of life. And part of that way of life is responsibly and lawfully owning firearms. We're comfortable with them, and we have for generations. Now, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Hudson's bill, the Concealed Carry Reciprocity Bill of 2017, is a common sense fix to a patchwork of state laws that will confuse and do confuse law-abiding Americans who have valid concealed carry permits in their own states, issued by their own states, when they want to travel to or through other states which have different concealed carry laws. Now, I want to make this very clear. H.R. 38 does not allow travel as long as the holder of a concealed carry license does not obey the laws of the states that he or she are traveling to. And I read directly, Mr. Speaker, from the statute, that this bill shall not be construed to supersede or limit the laws of any state. So the other side of the aisle just needs to make sure they get this exactly right, because they have not been incorrect on this fact. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Hudson's bill actually and additionally strengthens existing regulations by requiring federal government agencies to promptly and accurately require a reporting, rather, to the FBI, someone who's mentally ill, someone who has committed a serious crime, or someone who's in the country illegally and should not have a firearm. So this bill is a common sense bill that will help law-abiding Americans enjoy their Second Amendment right, their outdoor sporting activities, and help keep our families safer. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Virginia reserves. The gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, we're prepared to close if the other side is prepared to close.
Gentleman from New York.
Thank you. How much time do I have?
It has 2.5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, this bill is advanced, I'm not sure in the name of what, but what it is going to do is to make us less safe and to overrule all our states. Under this bill, someone who lives in New York could go to another state, doesn't even have to go to another state, just apply to the other state, get a concealed carry permit from that state, never set foot in that state, and then use it in New York, thus overriding New York's laws. Now, we have heard it said that this bill is necessary to protect the Second Amendment constitutional rights of gun owners. But the fact is, there is no Second Amendment constitutional right for concealed carry. In the District of Columbia versus Heller case, in which the Supreme Court said that the Second Amendment established a personal right, Justice Scalia's opinion held that the Second Amendment was not unlimited, that a variety of gun regulations were entirely consistent with the Constitution, and he said, quote, "The majority of American courts to consider the question have held that prohibitions on carrying concealed weapons were lawful under the Second Amendment or state analogies." So the Second Amendment argument is simply wrong or disingenuous. But let me say also, we are living in an epidemic of gun violence. 33,000 Americans are killed every year, 30,000 or more every year. No other country approaches this. No country, other than those at war, but no country in peacetime has more than 300 or 400 or even 100 or 72, and we have 33,000. It's not because of a mental illness. It's because of the presence of large numbers of guns. A 2017 Stanford University study found a direct correlation with the most permissive concealed carry laws and violent crime. General studies have shown a direct correlation of the prevalence of the presence of the number of guns and murder rates by guns. So this is a bill that is a death sentence for many Americans. That's what this bill is. It's a death sentence without trial for many Americans by increasing the danger of guns, by overruling states that fear that we don't want concealed weapons on the New York City subway or the Chicago metro or other places of great concentrations of people. But no, we in our wisdom are going to say that the states with the least restrictive, perhaps most rural, maybe sensible for them restrictions, will impose those restrictions on the other states. It is wrong. It is a death sentence for many Americans, and it ought not to pass. I yield back.
The gentleman from New York yields back. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, for the purpose of closing our arguments, it's my pleasure to yield the balance of my time to the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Schweikert.
The gentleman is recognized from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman. And this is one of those, we all have subjects that we find fascinating, and for 25 years I've actually kept files of abstracts on this because I actually participated in writing Arizona's 1993 concealed carry law. And I desperately wish this was an intellectually honest conversation about the data, because we all want our communities, our families to be safer. I believe I can show you the statistical abstract data. States like Arizona, adjusted for population, the violent use of firearms is almost 1/2 of what it was before the adoption of our concealed carry law. Now, was concealed carry responsible for that? Of course not. But it's a factor. Some of it's mental health, some of it's law enforcement, some of it's incarceration. It's complicated. But if you actually look at these data abstracts of crime statistics in the United States with the misuse of firearms, turns out states that have adopted concealed carry compared to states that have gone other directions, states have adopted have gotten safer. And there's actually some brilliant articles when you compare Florida and Illinois, big populated, complex, demographically complex states. Florida has gotten dramatically safer. Illinois has not. This, if you really love our families, love our communities, this needs to be an intellectually sound discussion of what factors make us safer as a society. I believe this bill leads us that direction. Yield back, Mr.
Gentleman
Speaker.
yields back for all time. All time for debate has expired. Pursuant to House Resolution 645, the previous question is ordered on the bill as amended. The question is on engrossed and third reading of the bill. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Third reading.
A bill to amend Title 18 United States Code to provide a means by which non-residents of a state whose residents may carry concealed firearms may also do so in the state.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I have a motion to recommit at the desk.
Is the gentleman opposed to the bill?
I am opposed.
The gentleman qualifies. The clerk will report the motion.
Mr. Thompson of California moves to recommit the bill H.R. 38 to the Committee on the Judiciary with instructions to report the same back to the House forthwith with the following amendments. Page 1, line 13, strike A and insert A1. Page 2, line 10, strike 1 and insert A.
Is there objection to dispense of the reading? The objection to the suspension of the reading. The reading is dispensed with. Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes to support his motion. For what purpose? Recognized.
This is the final amendment to the bill, which will not kill the bill nor send it back to committee. If adopted, the bill will immediately proceed to final passage as amended. Mr. Speaker, next week will be the 5th anniversary of the hideous mass murder at Sandy Hook Elementary, where 20 kids and 6 educators were slaughtered in their classroom. This year, we've witnessed 2 of the worst mass shootings in recent American history, in Las Vegas, Nevada, and Sutherland Springs, Texas. And every day, more than 30 people are killed by someone using a gun. This should be a call to action for everyone to work together to help prevent gun violence. That's why 90% of Americans support strengthening our gun laws, not weakening them. Let's be clear about what this Congress is going to do today. Instead of taking serious action on bump stocks or expanding background checks, the majority party is undermining the very laws that work to prevent gun violence. For example, some states allow people who have been convicted of some violent crimes to carry a loaded, concealed firearm. 30 states and the District of Columbia currently deny permits to people convicted of those violent crimes, such as assault and battery, threatening, or crimes committed with a weapon. So if you're from any of these states, Alaska, California, Connecticut, Delaware, Florida, Hawaii, Illinois, Iowa, Kentucky, Louisiana, Maryland, Massachusetts, Michigan, Minnesota, Missouri, Montana, Nebraska, Nevada, New Jersey, New Mexico, New York, North Carolina, North Dakota, Ohio, Oklahoma, Oregon, Texas, Utah, Virginia, West Virginia, or from the District of Columbia, a vote for this underlying bill is a vote to undermine your own state gun violence prevention policy. Because this bill says that even if your state prohibits its own residents who have been convicted of certain violent crimes, you can't prohibit someone from another state with the same criminal record from carrying a loaded, concealed firearm if their state allows it. This motion to recommit would state that a person who has been convicted of a violent crime within the preceding 3 years may not possess or carry a concealed handgun in a state that prohibits a person from doing so on the basis of a conviction for that very same offense. This would be people convicted of crimes such as resisting arrest, assault, permitting sexual abuse of a minor, aggravated assault, or violation of a criminal sexual assault protection orders. All violent crimes. An aye vote on this motion to recommit is a pro-states' right, pro-Second Amendment, and anti-criminal vote. I'm a gun owner. I have been all my life. I'm not opposed to concealed carry, but I am opposed to violent criminals having guns, and you should be too. I urge you to support this motion to recommit, and if you vote against it, you're voting to allow violent criminals, convicted criminals, to carry loaded, concealed firearms in your community, in your state, in your district. That's wrong. We should prohibit that from happening, and it's a real easy fix. Could have been fixed in committee. Could have been fixed in committee. You could have taken care of the concerns that you have with the restrictions on concealed carry, and you could have stopped criminals, convicted criminals, from carrying loaded, concealed firearms. But the committee didn't do it. We have a chance now. It's the last chance to do it before this bill comes to a vote. And I urge my friends on both sides of the aisle to vote for this motion to recommit, and I yield back the balance of my time.
For what purpose, gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I rise to claim the time in opposition to the motion to recommit.
The gentleman is recognized from Virginia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, with this motion to recommit, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are trying in vain to hamper the passage of this important legislation. H.R. 38 seeks to allow law-abiding citizens the ability to exercise their Second Amendment right when they cross state lines. The Supreme Court held in District of Columbia versus Heller that the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to possess a firearm unconnected with service in a militia and to use that firearm for traditionally lawful purposes such as self-defense. Further, the court concluded that the Second Amendment guarantees the individual right to possess and carry weapons in case of confrontation, and that central to this right is the inherent right of self-defense, quote unquote. Additionally, in McDonald versus City of Chicago, the Supreme Court ruled that the right of an individual to keep and bear arms as protected under the Second Amendment is incorporated by the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment against the states. An individual's Second Amendment right is no different than the First Amendment's protections on speech and free exercise of religious expression, and the Fourth Amendment's prohibition against unreasonable search and seizure, or the Eighth Amendment's prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment. Can you imagine my colleagues' outcries if any of the aforementioned rights stopped at their state's borders? Believe me, I can. They'd be loud and boisterous about it, and justifiably so. Despite that fact, here they are trying to derail a bill that affords the Second Amendment the same respect. Now, this motion to recommit attempts to extend the law, the federal law, which already bars people from having firearms if they've been convicted of a felony or misdemeanor domestic violence crimes by saying any violent crime be covered and they define violent crime by saying it means any offense that involves injury or the threat of injury to the person of another. Well, in my state of Virginia and in most other states, it's up to the police officer in a traffic accident. If you rear-end somebody and you injure them, whether or not you're simply charged with a traffic offense or you're charged with a criminal offense. And that should not be the basis of denying somebody their Second Amendment rights under the United States Constitution. I will not yield. I urge my colleagues to oppose this motion to recommit and support the underlying bill, and I yield back.
Without objection, the previous question is ordered. On the motion to recommit, the question is on the motion. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The noes have it. The motion is not agreed to.
Mr. Speaker, I ask for the recorded vote. Yeas and nays.
The gentleman asked for the yeas and nays. The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote for the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having arisen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their vote by electronic device. Pursuant to Clause 8 and Clause 9 of Rule 20, this 15-minute vote on the motion to recommit will be followed by a 5-minute vote on the passage of the bill if ordered, and to the motion to suspend the rules and agree to the House concurrent Resolution 90. This is a 15-minute vote.
The House this afternoon has been debating gun legislation, the first gun bill the House has considered since the Las Vegas and Texas church mass shootings earlier this fall. Here on C-SPAN, we're going to open up our phone lines. As you can see on the screen, our numbers are up, and we'd like to hear from you, your thoughts on the debate and the issue at hand. The bill the House is considering is actually a combination of two bills. One would allow concealed carry permit holders in one state to carry that firearm into another state that also allows concealed carry weapons. The other part of this bill was added by the Rules Committee yesterday, and it would expand the background check system. It would call on federal agencies to certify and strengthen relevant records to the NCIS. It would also call on the Justice Department to study the use of bump stocks in the commission of a crime. So for the next 15 minutes or so, we're going to open up our phone lines and get your reaction to what you've seen on the floor. The House will vote on this motion to recommit. This is a last chance for Democrats here to change the bill. The final passage vote will be next. We expect this to be the last bit of legislative work for the House this afternoon. We welcome our C-SPAN radio listeners as well, and welcome your input on Twitter, too. If you want to send us a tweet, it's at C-SPAN. Norwalk, Connecticut, first up, and Joe is on our Republican line. Welcome.
Well, hello. Thank you very much for taking my call. I've lived in Fairfield County, Connecticut, that's where the Sandy Hook massacre happened. And just three things briefly about that. I think our wives should be able to defend themselves. They got a pistol in their purse. It was late at night at a parking lot, and up there at Sandy Hook, let me tell you, a lot of police even say, police tell everybody, if you're in trouble, the police can't get there for a good 10 minutes, 20 minutes sometimes. Well, up at Sandy Hook, we all watched that. It was in our neighborhood. They haven't even released the police times yet. It took the police almost an hour to get in that building. They had a second-grade teacher. She came out with her kids. She says, I was in there for 45 minutes after the shooting stopped, and nobody came to the door. I was scared. Finally, somebody knocked on the door almost an hour later. It was a cop, finally. And then also, the kid, the monster, the murderer, he was in radio class in that school, and he was insane. They said he was putting a soldering iron to the top of his hand and hurting himself in school. The kid shouldn't have been in school. So, see, that's the school system failed. The cops tried, but they can't. The cops can only get there after the fact. It's just common sense.
And it was pointed out a couple of times on the House floor that the anniversary of the Newtown, Connecticut shooting was coming up next week. John's in Brooklyn on the others line. John, go ahead.
Hi, how are you today?
Doing fine, thank you.
Yeah, I've watched the vast majority of the debate today regarding this particular piece of legislation, and it's very disappointing, being a New Yorker, that the primary issue of whether or not legal individuals who've gone through the background check process and have concealed carry should be treated this way by our representatives. It seems to be a pretty simple issue. I myself am a concealed carry holder. I have 2 licenses, and it is a significant issue when moving or traveling between states. You can find yourself in a great deal of trouble, and I'm hoping that the bill does have the ability to pass today, because I think it will be a very good thing.
Are you a concealed carry holder because of the work you do?
No, I believe in the Constitution. I believe in the Second Amendment.
John in Brooklyn, thanks for the call. 202-748-8921 for Republicans, 202-748-8920 for Democrats. All others independents, 202-748-8922. Laguna Niguel, California, our Democrats line. And this is Laney.
Hi. Yeah, I've been watching C-SPAN too. Thank you so much for televising it. So I've been watching yesterday and today. The Republicans just talk about their Second Amendment rights, that they don't have enough. They don't have enough Second Amendment rights. They want more. They want no restrictions. Whereas the Democrats talk about saving lives, the horrible number of deaths that are happening and happen every single day, and mass shootings. And the Democrats talk about safety. And anytime the Republicans mention safety, it's convoluted. It makes no sense. It's twisted. They twist the facts, and that's my comments. Thank you.
Here's Grangeville, Idaho. We hear from Ted on the Republican line.
Yeah, how's it going?
Hi, Ted. Hey, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Well, hey, thanks, man. Hey, it's like I just heard there about the Democrats. They say, somebody from one state can go to another state and get a concealed weapon permit, which is false because you got to have a state ID. And what they're saying about, Sandy Hook and everything else is like, it's just crazy. But it's like, why don't they stop that? Why don't they get with the Republicans and get rid of the people that shouldn't have the guns?
If you're just tuning in here on C-SPAN and C-SPAN Radio, the House is voting here, finishing up work on a gun legislation. And the bill actually combines 2 different efforts. One deals with concealed carry holders in states and allowing those individuals to carry their firearms into other states. The other deals with the National Criminal Background Check System and expanding that. 15-minute vote here on the motion to recommit, a last chance for Democrats to change the bill before final passage. On Twitter at C-SPAN, Giselle, why would we want a criminal who is denied a gun in one state to be able to get one in another state? Please vote no. Bobby tweets, the bill, H.R. 38, must be passed. New Rochelle, New York. Vince on the Independent line.
Yes, hi. How you doing? I'm enjoying the show as usual. I just thought I'd call in. It's the first time I've called. I live in New York State, and it's virtually impossible for me to get a pistol permit. Not that I would really have to have a pistol permit, but I do understand many of the folks out there who say you have the right to defend yourself in your home and on the street if need be. It's a known fact of life that if you're confronted by someone, like the other lady who called saying Republicans are crazy about this, I would like to ask her, if she's walking down the street with her daughter or young son and someone comes to try to kidnap her child, tell you what you do. You go, get on your cell phone and call the police and see how much help you get right away. I'm not saying we want people roaming the streets with guns and getting into fights everywhere, but as a gentleman who's a bit older, I have kids, I have to tell you that many of my Democratic friends who are frothing at the mouth about gun possession have no good answer. For people like me, I like to regard myself as a normal human being. I'm not some fanatic. I think we should have regular, real good gun control things. They should do away with these bump stocks. You don't really need these rapid-fire weapons. But Democrats don't even want me in New York to be able to own a weapon to protect me and my family.
Hey, John, you're the second...
Sorry.
Vince, you're the second caller we've had from New York. We had a caller from Brooklyn who had a concealed carry permit, but talked about some of the difficulty going state to state. Why is it so difficult for you in New Rochelle to get a permit in the first place in New York?
Well, the only way you can get a full carry pistol permit in New York, and I don't know if the gentleman explained much of his background, but he must be in security. He must own a business that has a lot of cash flow. And he must know politicians, because the average person in New York cannot get a pistol permit because there are just way too many hoops to jump.
Hey, Vince, appreciate that. Another call waiting. This one also from New York, a Democratic caller. William, go ahead. Allegheny, New York. Hello, go ahead. Oh, I'm sorry, William. Let's try that again, and we'll go to Allegheny, New York. Sorry about that. Go ahead.
Hi. I have a concealed carry permit for New York State since 1992, and I believe this legislation should pass because I live very close to the Pennsylvania border in the southern tier of New York.
Yeah.
So it's very, very easy for me to cross into Pennsylvania almost on a daily basis because I live, within 10 minutes of the line. So in fact, I'm in the process of trying to get a Pennsylvania carry permit as well, so that I don't, because I am a law-abiding citizen, and I don't feel that a person that is going to commit a crime with their gun cares whether they have this type of legislation or not.
And under this legislation that the House has been debating this afternoon, it would allow people with concealed carry permits in one state to go into another state that allows concealed carry as well. That's part of the bill. The bill would also expand the background check system, in particular with federal agencies, and call for the Judiciary Committee, the Justice Department rather, to do a study on bump stocks. The Washington Post writes in the Senate, Democrats have labeled the concealed carry legislation a non-starter, while Senate Republicans caution that pairing the bills is a recipe for the demise of both. John Cornyn of Texas, the number 2 Republican, quoted saying, when you put them together, it makes it harder for us to do what we can do and do it now. By the way, the Judiciary Committee in the Senate today considered some legislation, gun legislation, including efforts by Dianne Feinstein and others on expanding background checks. And we covered that today as well on the C-SPAN networks. You can see that later in our schedule and also at cspan.org. To Addison, Texas, on our Republican line, Eric, good afternoon.
Hey, thanks for taking my call. How are you doing?
Doing fine, thanks.
Well, I live in the great state of Texas, and I've got a concealed carry permit. I've been following this legislation and debate all afternoon. I've just got to say, these Democrats are barking up the wrong tree. With me being in Texas, a lot of us have concealed carry permits, and we're simply law-abiding citizens. I mean, if you go look at the statistics, we commit far less crimes than police officers, and having that sense of protection that comes with having the gun on you, it just helps so much if you're in a sticky situation where the police are minutes away and they might not be able to save you. You look at these senators who say, it's the 5th anniversary of Sandy Hook. Sandy Hook was a very tragic event, but you got to think of the fact, if a few teachers were carrying guns, would the carnage be that severe? I would doubt that. A school district near my house in Argyle, Texas, they recently armed their teachers, and they posted signs outside their school door saying, deadly force is authorized should you be a intruder or whatever. And I can tell you there have been no problems. I mean, our city is very safe, our area is very safe, our state's very safe as a whole. But having that sign out there, that's so much of a deterrent than another sign that says gun-free zone, no one's allowed to carry. So that's just my take on it. I hope this legislation passes. And for me, myself, I'm a pilot. And when I travel to different states, I can't tell you the number of times I've got to look online and make sure where I go can be carried as far as my firearm is concerned. And so it shouldn't be like that.
Eric, you're a commercial pilot?
Commercial pilot, yes, sir.
Thanks for weighing in. Let's go to Rick in Peoria, Arizona, Independent Line.
Hi, thank you very much for taking my call. I just wanted to let you know that I live in Arizona, which is constitutional carry. which has real good gun laws. And I'm from Massachusetts, which I had a permit from 21 years old all the way up until I left there. And not to give you my age, but I'm 63 years old. So I've had a permit in 2 different states. One that was harder to get it than the one I'm in now. Well, you still have to qualify and do all that stuff in Arizona, just like you have to take a course.
Do you have to requalify every couple of years? Make sure you're still capable of understanding firing and using the weapon, the firearm.
When you put in for your permit, when you put in for a renewal, that's checked again to see if there's anything on a NICS or criminal background. I was a gun dealer in the state of Massachusetts. That was a very tough FFL to get, And I want to just explain one thing about the couple of people in New York. John Stossel had death threats on him, and he couldn't even get one in New York. And he is in the media, all right? A couple of years ago, some paper, I think it was newspaper or something, put in, which was a very bad act. They put in this, in the paper, all the people that have concealed carry weapons permits in New York. And where do you think first thing is a bad thing because you have law enforcement. Nobody should know where a retired law enforcement guy lives, That's one thing, or judges or any of that kind of stuff. But it's ironic that the most gun permits were in Westchester County, which will not even let you hunt with a rifle or a shotgun. It's bow only. So these are all liberal people that don't want you to have what they have.
Reaction on Twitter as well. Here's Hillary tweeting, "We are watching. Elected officials need to know we are watching and will remember how they vote when they are up for re-election." Leslie says the legislation, CCR, bad for New Jersey, but another view. "I'm a Democrat from California here. I think this H.R. 38 is great, much needed. Need to defend my family." Grand Prairie, Texas, our Democrats line, and this is Kermit. Hello there.
Hi. Yes, I'm a Democrat as well as a concealed handgun owner. I believe the legislation should pass. Currently, right now, with Texas and a lot of other states, if you have a concealed handgun license in Texas, you are able to travel in other states. So I believe the person that was speaking from Florida was stating that people don't have the right to come in other states that have concealed gun licenses. That's an incorrect state. I can travel to Florida. I can travel to Louisiana, Arkansas, Nevada, and other states with my concealed handgun permit. I have to abide by those laws within those states if I go there. So with the current legislation as it is that they're trying to get passed, those same laws will be in effect with those states if it does pass and I travel there. So there's a lot of misinformation that's being given out by the Democrats, and I'm sad to hear that. But concealed handgun persons, by statistics, are the most law-abiding citizens in the United States, and I'm hoping that the legislation pass.
Debate in the House on the gun legislation has wrapped up. They did an hour of general debate, an hour or more, with the motion to recommit, and that's where we are now. The motion to recommit vote, a last chance to change the bill. The final passage vote is next. It's a bill with 2 parts, part of it dealing with the background check system, the other part expanding the concealed carry, allowing those in states approving of that to carry into other states that also allow concealed carry. Our numbers are 202-748-8921 for Republicans, Democrats 202-748-8920, and Independents 202-748-8922. We'll take a few more calls as the vote winds down. Lodi, New Jersey, and Steve is on our Republican line.
Hi. First off, I'm a first-time caller, and I would like to thank you for taking my call.
Glad to have you here. Thanks.
Thank you. So let's just start off by saying I am a conservative, and I live in a very liberal state. And unfortunately, we have a governor-elect that will be put into office shortly, stating that he will make this state a sanctuary state. Me being a strong believer in the Second Amendment and the Constitution, I wish that there would be something that could be done to help protect people in states just like what this state might become, just like states like California and these other states. we need to be able to protect ourselves and our families. And I don't believe that I have a lot of family in states like Texas and Florida, all over the United States, Virginia. I don't believe that when they come to visit me here in my home, that they should have to worry on how they should protect themselves. Maybe they'll go to jail. I don't believe that their rights of protecting themselves or their families should end at state lines. And I believe that according to our Constitution and the Second Amendment rights, we should be able to protect ourselves, our families, freely without any infringement on our rights. And
thank you, sir. We'll go to Hanford, California, and hear from Mike on the independent line.
Hey, welcome. Thank you for taking my call. I'm a certified NRA instructor, Department of Justice instructor in California, and I've watched my legislators in Sacramento take my rights left and right. And so this needs to be approved. As has been repeated numerous times, concealed carriers tend to be the safest people out there, and it's something like a 0.0001% have ever gotten in any problem. So there's a lot of misstatements going on. And when the Democrats keep talking about allowing criminals to carry, they're already carrying. They're not going to wait for a concealed carry. And so we have criminals out there carrying, and I want to be able to keep my family safe.
All right, let's hear next from Macon, Georgia. Stephan on our Democrats line as the vote begins to wrap up. Go ahead, Stephan.
Thank you for allowing me to speak. I would like to say that some people have a very perverse understanding of the Second Amendment. I think when you look back to the Federalist number 29, Alexander Hamilton kind of lays out the original intent for it. And to the one caller speaking about your inherent right to self-defense, the Supreme Court did rule you have an inherent right to self-defense, but this is talking about concealed carry. I am a resident of Alabama. I have a concealed carry permit for Alabama. I'm former military, and I have engaged in high-risk training, so I'm very proficient with a handgun. And with that, I have knowledge that you just don't simply point and pull the trigger and the bullet's going to go where you want it to go. To gain those kind of skills takes years of dedication and training, and Alabama currently does not require any training, any safety requirements. It's merely just a background check, and you pay a fee. I would ask people who are in favor of this to go to the range and do target practice, and let's see how accurate they are with the handgun. And then, would you want someone who isn't hitting paper to be able to carry a handgun, and now they're going to be discharging it in situations where there's innocent bystanders nearby? Also, I think we need to address the issue that the CDC is no longer allowed to collect data on gun deaths. And it's great that we're throwing out all this data and all these statistics, but at the end of the day, you simply cannot say without a reasonable doubt that any of those statistics are accurate, because the federal government is barred from collecting data on gun-related deaths.
Some good information there, Stephan. We'll let you go there as the vote begins to wrap up on the motion to recommit, and it is not passing. They will vote next. Final passage on the gun legislation. One more thought from Lena, who tweets, you can be arrested in New Jersey with a legally owned firearm unloaded in your vehicle. H.R. 38 is very much needed legislation. We'll see what happens. The final vote is next.
Have all members voted? On this vote, the yeas are 190, the nays are 236. The motion is adopted. The question is on passage of the bill. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Speaker.
The gentleman from New York.
And then I ask for a roll call, recorded vote.
The gentleman has asked for a recorded vote. A recorded vote is requested. Those favoring a recorded vote will rise. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 5-minute vote.
It is the final passage vote on a bill that is actually the combination of two bills. The bill would allow gun owners with concealed carry permits from one state to carry their firearms into another state with concealed carry laws. It also would call for expanded enforcement of laws involving the National Criminal Background Check System and require that federal agencies certify they have added relevant records to the NICS, and would also call for the Justice Department to study the use of bump stocks in the commission of a crime. 5-minute final passage vote.
On this vote, the yeas are 231, the nays are 198. The bill is passed without objection. The motion to reconsider is laid on the table.